You are standing at the edge of the River Medway on a grey morning during the ceasefire, and before you lies the Chatham Dockyard in a quiet so complete that even the water seems to hold its breath. The tide has just turned, lapping against the timber piers with a soft, endless, patient sound that has no beginning and no end. A thin mist clings to the river's surface, blurring the line between water and sky, and through this mist the anchored ships appear as silent silhouettes, their masts bare, their rigging hanging slack in the windless air. Nothing moves with urgency. No signal flags snap, no drums beat, no orders echo across the basin. The war for this small stretch of time is a distant memory, and all the labour of the yard has slowed to the pulse of a single, repetitive craft conducted inside a very long brick building at the water's edge. The building is the Ropewalk, and it stretches along the riverbank for a quarter of a mile, its red tile roof glistening with dew that has not yet dried. The bricks are old and mottled, stained by decades of damp English weather, and the structure is so narrow that from where you stand it looks like a tunnel laid on its side, a long finger of pale red and brown pointing toward the grey horizon. High windows run the entire length of both sides, small panes of glass set in iron frames, and they catch the early light in a muted, silvery way, as if the building itself is still half asleep. A chimney at the far end releases a thin wisp of smoke that rises straight up and then dissolves into the mist. The door at the near end is made of heavy oak, worn smooth around the iron latch from the touch of countless hands, and it stands slightly open, inviting you to step inside without any fuss or ceremony. You walk toward the door over cobblestones that are damp and dark, and you hear your own footsteps as a quiet scuff and nothing more. The air around you carries the scent of the river, a mix of salt and mud, and the clean, cold freshness of tidal water. But beneath it, another smell is already reaching you. It is the dry, green, dusty scent of hemp, so constant and so deeply woven into the fabric of the place that it seems to rise from the ground itself. When you push the door open and step across the threshold, that scent embraces you fully, filling your nose and your throat with a soft, hay-like warmth. The light inside is dimmer than the outside, filtered through the dusty glass of the long windows, and it falls on a wooden floor that stretches away from you in a straight, uninterrupted line, its planks worn to a silken smoothness by centuries of feet walking the same path backward and forward without ever deviating. The floorboards are wide and dark with age, and the gaps between them are filled with a fine powder of hemp dust that has settled over time, a pale greyish-brown layer that puffs up in tiny clouds when you take your first step inside. The Ropewalk is a single long room, and looking down its length, you feel as though you are staring into a vanishing point in a perspective drawing. The two walls and the floor and the pitch ceiling all converge at a distant rectangle of light that is the door at the other end. The ceiling is supported by wooden beams that cross overhead at regular intervals, their edges softened by the same dust, and from some of them hang coils of rope in various stages of completion, dark and oily, faintly sticky with tar. The silence here is not a thin silence, but a thick one, layered with the memory of sound, the creak of a wheel, the rustle of hemp, the scuff of leather on wood, all of it resting now in the early morning hush before the day's work begins. You walk slowly down the center of the walkway, and your eyes adjust to the light, revealing the tools of the ropemaker's trade arranged neatly along the walls. There are spinning wheels of different sizes, their wooden frames polished by use, the drive bands slack, the hooks and spindles clean and waiting. There are great bundles of raw hemp stacked like sleeping animals, the fibres pale yellow and grey and brown, bound with coarse twine and smelling of distant fields. Wooden buckets of tar sit with their lids fitted tight, though a faint black stickiness has seeped around the rims. Beside them lie iron hooks, topmakers' guides, forming plates, and wooden pegs driven into the walls to hold unfinished strands. Everything is orderly, clean, and still, as if the building itself is a great instrument that will soon be played by hands that know every note by heart. You pause at one of the high windows and look out at the dockyard beyond. The view is of a world made in soft greys and muted greens. The river moves slowly. The masts of the ships tilt ever so slightly with the tide, and the roofs of the storehouses and workshops form a jagged line against the pale sky. A seagull stands on a post, its head tucked, and does not stir. The cobblestones of the quay are wet, reflecting the light like a mirror that has grown dull with breath. No carts rumble, no hammers ring from the forge, no voices call. The entire dockyard is holding its peace, and you understand that this is what a ceasefire looks like. Not a celebration, not a rest from heroic deeds, but a simple, quiet continuation of the small necessary labors that keep the world turning. Like the making of rope. Your gaze returns to the interior, and you notice the way the dust hangs in the air and the long shafts of light that slant down from the windows. Each beam of light is visible as a solid column, pale gold where it touches the floor, and within it the hemp dust drifts so slowly that a single particle might take a whole minute to fall from the height of the window to the ground. The temperature inside the ropewalk is cooler than the outside air, constant and still, like the air in a cellar or an old church. The bricks of the walls hold the damp, and the whole building smells not just of hemp and tar but of time itself, a faintly mineral, earthy scent like stone after rain. It is a place that has known no change for generations, and its calm is the calm of something very old that expects no surprises. You walk farther, your steps muffled, and you begin to notice details that the first glance missed. The wooden floor, for all its smoothness, is marked by a long, straight groove that runs exactly down the center of the walkway. It is the path worn by thousands of backward steps, a shallow indentation less than an inch deep, but unmistakable once you see it. This is the track of the spinner, the man who will walk backward for miles over the course of a day, twisting fibres into yarn, and you can almost feel the ghost of that motion in the slight slope of the boards. The groove is darkest at the starting end and fades gradually toward the middle, as if the most pressure is applied at the beginning of each journey. At intervals along the walk, there are low wooden benches, simple and backless, placed there not for rest but for the ropemaker to set down his tools or to sit while mending a broken thread. They show the same polish of use, their edges rounded, their surfaces free of splinters. On one bench, you see a small clay pipe left behind, its bowl still containing a pinch of ash, as if the worker stepped away only a moment ago. The air is so still that the ash has not scattered, and you are careful not to breathe too close to it. The quiet is so deep that you can hear your own heartbeat if you listen, a soft, distant drum that seems to come from somewhere outside your body. You can also hear the building itself, not a creak or a groan, but a kind of low hum that might be the movement of air through the bricks or the distant vibration of the river against the foundations. It is a sound that makes you feel as if the ropewalk is a living thing, breathing slowly in its sleep. Far at the other end, a pigeon has found its way inside and perches on a beam, its cooing so faint that it barely registers as sound, but rather as a texture added to the silence. You stop walking when you have reached roughly the middle of the building, and you turn around to look back at the door through which you entered. It is now a rectangle of lighter grey, a framed picture of the misty world outside. The sense of distance is strange here. Because the walkway is so narrow and so long, the door seems both very close and impossibly far away, a trick of perspective that makes you feel suspended between 2 points. The same vanishing point effect applies in the opposite direction. Turning again, you see the far door as a small bright speck, no bigger than a coin. You imagine the spinner walking backward from one end to the other, covering this entire distance in a series of slow, deliberate steps that take hours to complete, and the thought is calming, like watching a tide come in. Hemp is the soul of this place, and its presence is everywhere you look. In addition to the stacked bales, you notice loose fibres caught on the rough surfaces of the brickwork, small hanks hung on hooks to dry, and a fine layer of greenish dust on every horizontal surface. The smell, which never lessens, has a slight sweetness to it, like dried grass, and a bass note that is earthy and slightly bitter. It is not an unpleasant smell, but a grounding one, the kind that makes you want to breathe slowly and deeply. You can see how the hemp arrives in the building as a tangled mass and leaves as a smooth, strong rope, transformed by nothing more than patience, walking, and the steady twist of a wheel. The tools that perform this transformation are humble and few. There is no complex machinery here, no engines or gears, only simple iron and wood that have been used in the same way for hundreds of years. On the wall near the middle of the walkway, someone has written a date in chalk, 1667. The numbers are faint and smudged, but they remind you that this place existed during a time of great naval conflict, and yet here, inside the Ropewalk, that conflict feels far away, a thing of maps and dispatches that never penetrates the steady rhythm of the hemp. The ceasefire is an official fact, but within these walls the work goes on regardless, uninterrupted, unconcerned with the signing of treaties or the sailing of fleets. The rope is needed whether the ships are fighting or resting, and the Ropewalk provides it, day after day, without hurry or pause. You walk to one of the larger spinning wheels and place your hand lightly on its rim. The wood is cool and smooth, and you can feel the slight give of the drive band, a leather strap that connects the large wheel to the small spindle. The mechanism is simple. Turning the wheel causes the spindle to rotate, and the spinner, walking backward, feeds the hemp fibres onto the rotating hook. The tension is controlled entirely by the pressure of the spinner's hands and the speed of his backward steps. There is no motor, no pedal, no gear, just human rhythm and the patience to do one thing for many hours. The wheel, now still, seems to hold that patience in its very grain. You notice how the light has shifted slightly since you entered. The sun is still hidden behind the cloud layer, but the mist is beginning to thin, and the quality of light inside the building is now a little brighter, a little more golden. The dust motes are more visible, swirling in slow, lazy spirals when you move past them. The soft cooing of the pigeon has stopped, and you realize the bird has flown out through some gap under the eaves. Outside, the seagull on the post has also departed, and the surface of the river is now a smooth sheet of pewter, unbroken by any ripple. The tide is still coming in, and it has lifted the anchored ships so gently that their bowsprits now point at a slightly different angle to the sky. Time moves differently in the Ropewalk. Minutes stretch and merge, and you find that you have lost track of how long you have been standing there, looking at the spinning wheel, listening to the building breathe. This is the genius of the place. It asks nothing of you except your stillness. It was built for a single purpose, and has fulfilled that purpose without deviation, and in doing so, it has become a kind of temple to the ordinary, a monument to the quiet daily labor that holds the world together. The warships outside may carry cannons and admirals, but they cannot move without rope, and rope cannot be made without this long, patient, backward walking. Your attention is drawn to a coil of finished rope lying near the far wall, a thick cable of 3 strands laid together, each strand made of many yarns, each yarn made of countless hemp fibres twisted together. The rope is as thick as your wrist and coils around itself in a perfect circle, the end tucked under to keep it from unraveling. It is dark with tar, almost black in the dim light, and you can see the spiral pattern of the twist running its entire length. It has a weighty presence, a sense of stored strength that is completely still. This rope will one day lift a sail or hold an anchor, but now it rests on the dusty floor, waiting. The rope store at the end of the building is full of such coils, laid row upon row like sleeping creatures, and the smell of tar in there will be even stronger, a thick, protective scent that preserves the fibers against salt water and sun. You walk to the far door, which is also slightly open, and you look out at the river from this new angle. The view is almost identical to the one from the front door, and yet the slight shift in perspective makes the ships look a little closer, the far shore a little more distinct. The mist has lifted enough that you can see the outline of the hills on the opposite bank, low and green and empty. The water is so calm that the reflections of the ships are perfect mirror images, broken only by the occasional drift of a small piece of wood or a clump of weed. The air feels clean, and you take one deep breath before stepping back inside. Now the Ropewalk has settled fully into its morning state, the light steady, the silence complete, the hemp waiting. Somewhere nearby, a door opens and closes with a soft thud, and you hear footsteps on the cobblestones outside. The footsteps are slow and even, the gait of a man who is not in a hurry and never has been. You step away from the door and find a place to stand beside one of the high windows, your shoulder resting against the cool brick wall. The latch of the main door clicks, and the heavy oak swings open a little wider. A man enters. He is the spinner, the ropemaker, who will walk backward today. He wears a simple woolen cap, a linen shirt with rolled sleeves, knee breeches, and a leather apron that is stained with tar and hemp dust. In his hand, he carries a small bundle of personal tools wrapped in cloth. He does not look around, because he knows every inch of this space. He simply walks to the spinning wheel you touched earlier, sets down his bundle, and begins the quiet preparations of his day. His movements are unhurried and precise, and you watch him in the calm certainty that the long backward walk is about to begin. The rope walk Raking waited in silence is now ready, and the ancient rhythm will soon resume, filling the dusty air with the sound of twisting fibre and the soft tread of feet moving backward, step by step, until the light fades and the day is done. The spinner sets his small bundle of tools on the wooden bench and unties the cloth wrapping with fingers that move from long habit, neither fast nor slow. The cloth is a square of old linen, frayed at the edges, and inside it are a knife with a bone handle worn yellow, a splicing fid of polished ironwood, and a lump of beeswax the color of pale honey. He lays these items in a row, straightening them without conscious thought, and then he hangs his woolen cap on a wooden peg driven into the brick wall beside the spinning wheel. His hair is the color of wet sand, cut short, and his face carries the calm expression of a man who has done this work for so many years that it no longer feels like work, merely the way his body moves through time. Behind him, the main door opens again, and two assistants enter, young men with the broad shoulders and quiet step of those who carry heavy things without complaint. They are the hemp dressers, the ones who will prepare the raw bales for the spinner's hands. They waste no movement. One walks to the nearest stack of hemp bales, while the other swings open a set of wooden shutters on the riverside of the building, letting in more of the grey morning light. The additional illumination spreads across the floor in a pale wash, and now you can see the details of the hemp stack clearly. The bales are wrapped in coarse sacking, tied with tarred twine, and each one is stamped with the mark of the rigger merchant who shipped it across the North Sea months ago. The first assistant kneels beside a bale and cuts the twine with a short knife, pulling the sacking away to reveal the raw hemp inside. The sight of it is unexpectedly beautiful in the quiet way of natural things. The fibres are long and tangled, ranging in color from pale straw to a deeper greenish brown, and they shimmer faintly under the dusting of powder that clings to the surface. The scent that rises from the opened bale is stronger now, a green and living smell that fills the space around the stack like a cloud. It is the concentrated essence of hemp, sharper than what you smelled when you entered, and it has a slight sharpness that tickles the back of the throat. The assistant reaches into the mass and lifts out a thick hank of fibres, shaking it gently to loosen the strands, and a small shower of dust and broken bits falls to the floor. This is the herds, the short, woody pieces of the hemp stalk that cannot be spun into yarn. They separate from the long fibres with a soft, dry rustle, and the assistant collects them in a rough basket woven from willow. Nothing is wasted here. The herds will be used for kindling in the dockyard stoves, or for packing between the timbers of ships to caulk the seams. The basket fills slowly, and the wooden floor around the stack becomes littered with a fine litter of pale splinters and dust that will be swept away later by the apprentice with the broom. The assistant works with a steady rhythm, pulling the hanks apart, letting the herds fall, and draping the cleaned fibres over a low rack that stands beside the stack. The rack is a simple frame of ash wood with horizontal bars, and the long hemp strands hang over it like pale hair, straightening slowly under their own weight. The second assistant has opened another bale and is now carrying armfuls of the loose hemp to a wooden table set near the center of the ropey walk. The table is scarred and dark, its surface polished by years of handling fibre, and at one end sits the topmaker's guide, a flat iron plate with a small hole drilled through its center. Beside it rests a wooden comb with iron teeth, called a hackle, fixed to the table's edge. The assistant spreads a handful of hemp across the table, working it with his fingers to separate the strands that are still clinging together, and the sound of this work is a gentle, continuous rustle like dry leaves stirred by a breeze. The morning light now falls directly on the table, and the hemp fibres glow against the dark wood, each one distinct and fine. You watch the assistants move, and you notice how their actions complement each other without any need for speech. One fills the rack with dressed hemp, while the other works the table, and the piles of cleaned fibre grow at a steady, unhurried pace. The air inside the ropey walk has warmed a little with the opening of the door and the movement of bodies, and the scent of hemp now carries a faint note of dust and the leather of the men's aprons. The tall windows, now admitting more light, show that the mist outside is thinning further, the sky shifting from grey to a softer silver white. The river reflects this paler sky, and the ships look less like silhouettes now and more like solid things, their wood grain just visible on the nearest hulls. The spinner, meanwhile, has been standing quietly by his wheel, examining the drive band and the spindle with the careful attention of a man who knows that a single loose thread can spoil a whole day's work. He runs his thumb along the leather strap, feeling for worn spots, then rubs a small piece of beeswax along its length to keep it supple. The wax darkens the leather and leaves a faint, greasy sheen on his fingers. He checks the hook that will hold the twisting yarn, a curved iron spike that rotates on a bearing of oiled brass, and he gives it a gentle spin with one finger. It turns silently, without wobble, for nearly a minute before coming to rest. Satisfied, he walks to the table where the dressed hemp is piling up, and he selects a thick handful of the longest, palest fibres, lifting them to the light to inspect their quality. They are smooth and even, free of knots, and they hang from his grip in a straight fall like a waterfall made of silk thread. Now the most personal part of the preparation begins. The spinner returns to his starting position near the wheel and unrolls a length of coarse linen that has been lying on the bench, a strip of cloth about 6 inches wide and long enough to wrap around his waist several times. This is his waist apron, the bundle that will feed him fibres as he walks. He tucks one end into the leather belt that cinches his breeches and begins to lay the dressed hemp onto the cloth in careful layers, spreading the fibres so they run parallel and overlap slightly, building a pad of even thickness that will unwind steadily from the outside. His fingers move with the precision of long practice, teasing out any clumps, discarding any remaining bits of hurd, and pressing the layers down flat. The pile grows to the thickness of a man's forearm, a dense mat of pale fibres that smells intensely green and alive. When the hemp is arranged to his satisfaction, he rolls the cloth around it, forming a long bundle shaped like a bolster, and he tucks the loose end of the cloth securely under the layers. He then ties the bundle around his waist, not too tight to restrict his breathing, but snug enough that it will not shift during the long walk. The bundle rides at the small of his back, and the loose end of the hemp pokes out from the wrapping on the right side, ready to be drawn by his hand. He adjusts it once, then twice, settling the weight against his hips, and then he stands still for a moment, breathing slowly, his eyes resting on the distant rectangle of light at the far end of the ropey walk. There is no ceremony in this pause, no visible sign of preparation for a great effort, only the quiet centering of a craftsman about to begin his task. The assistants have finished opening the bales and have stacked the empty sacking neatly beside the door. The younger of the two takes up a broom with a long handle and begins to sweep the floor in slow, broad arcs, gathering the scattered herds and dust into a pile near the wall. The bristles of the broom whisper against the wooden boards, a soft rhythmic sound that blends with the rustle of the hemp and the distant lapping of the river. The other assistant has moved to the spinning wheel and is checking that the turner, a simple wooden crank connected to the wheel by a peg and slot mechanism, moves freely. He oils a small hinge with a feather dipped in a pot of neatsfoot oil, and the faint animal smell of the oil mixes briefly with the hemp before fading. Outside, a single bell tolls from the dockyard chapel, a low bronze note that rolls across the water and through the high windows, lasting for 3 slow seconds before dying away. It is the hour mark, the signal that the working day is beginning in earnest. But inside the ropey walk, no one reacts to it. The bell is simply another part of the environment, like the light and the smell and the steady weight of the air. The spinner has heard this bell on thousands of mornings, and it has long since ceased to register as anything but background texture. The light now has a settled quality, the diffuse brightness of an overcast mid-morning that will likely not change for many hours. The dust hanging in the air has been stirred by the opening of the bales, and it swirls in slow currents, visible as golden motes wherever the light falls strongest. The temperature remains cool and constant, the thick brick walls holding the night's chill well into the day. The spinner rolls his shoulders once, feeling the weight of the hemp bundle settle, and then he reaches to the wheel and gives it a gentle, experimental turn. The leather drive band catches with a soft thump, the spindle begins to rotate, and the iron hook spins with a faint metallic whisper. The sound is exactly what you would expect. A low, rhythmic creak that is not unpleasant. the kind of sound that might accompany a rocking chair or a slow-turning windlass. The spinner does not start his walk yet. He takes up his splicing fid and slips it into a leather sheath on his belt, where it will be close at hand if a thread breaks. He checks that the ironwood is smooth, sliding his thumb along its polished length, and then he tucks the small pot of beeswax into a pocket on the inside of his apron. Every tool has its place, and every place is known without looking. The order of these small preparations is itself a kind of calm ritual, repeated so many times that thought is not required. The hands know what to do, and the mind is free to drift in the quiet of the long room. The assistants have now seated themselves on wooden stools near the hemp table, and they will remain there for much of the day, feeding the spinner more dressed fibre when his bundle runs low. They talk to each other in low murmuring voices that do not carry, discussing something ordinary and forgettable. Their words are like the cooing of the pigeon that has since returned to its beam, a soft, intermittent sound that adds to the texture of the place without demanding attention. One of them reaches into his pocket and pulls out a small apple, which he eats slowly. The crisp crunch, the loudest sound in the room, for a brief moment. The spinner walks to the far end of the rope walk, or rather to the point about 1/3 of the way from the front door, where today's starting mark has been chalked on the floor. The chalked line is a simple white dash, slightly curved where it crosses the groove worn into the boards, and it looks fresh. Each day begins at a different mark, because the rope being made today is of a different thickness and length from the one made yesterday, and the starting point is calculated with an old formula that the spinner carries in his memory. He places his feet behind the mark and faces the far door, his back to the direction he will walk. The bundle of hemp rides securely at his waist, and the loose end trails over his right hip. The turner has taken his position at the wheel, a young man with strong arms who will crank the handle for the entire duration of the spin. He adjusts his grip on the wooden handle, tests the resistance, and then looks toward the spinner, waiting. There is no signal given, no nod or word, because the rhythm is understood. The spinner will attach the first fibres to the hook, and when the twist begins, the turner will start cranking, and the walk will commence. The rope walk holds its breath, the dust settling, the light steady, the assistants still on their stools, and the spinner bends to take the first pinch of hemp from his bundle, his fingers closing around the pale fibres with the gentleness of someone touching a living thing. The strand is about to be drawn, and the long backward journey is only a moment away. The spinner bends forward with the slow, weightless motion of a man who has spent a lifetime bending, and he draws from the bundle at his waist a pinch of hemp fibres, no thicker than a child's finger. He holds them between his thumb and forefinger, feeling their texture, their slight coolness, their readiness to be twisted. The fibres are the palest of the batch, nearly white in the grey light, and they trail from his grip in a soft, unbroken line that leads back to the rolled bundle. With his other hand he reaches out and touches the iron hook of the spinning wheel, stopping its slow, idle spin with a fingertip, and then he loops the pinch of hemp around the hook in a single, simple knot that will not slip under tension but can be released with a quick pull when the time comes. The knot is small and neat, a twist and a tuck made by fingers that could tie it in total darkness, and when he lets go the fibres hang from the hook in a short, limp tail. The turner has been watching without watching, his hand resting on the crank, his eyes half focused on the far end of the rope walk. Now he shifts his weight from one foot to the other, settling himself, and he begins to turn the wheel. The motion is not a fast spin, but a steady, deliberate rotation, the kind of pace that can be maintained for hours without tiring. The great wooden wheel, its rim darkened by the oil of countless hands, starts to move with a low, resonant creak that is more vibration than sound. The leather drive band tightens and slips for a fraction of a second before finding its grip, and then the spindle at the top of the frame begins to rotate, carrying the iron hook with it. The hook turns, and the hemp fibres turn with it, and the twist begins. The spinner does not look at the hook. His eyes are fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance, the far door perhaps, or the long shaft of light that falls through the nearest window, and his body begins to lean backward into the first step. He lifts his left foot and places it behind him, the leather sole meeting the wooden floor with a soft, definite sound that is almost a sigh. The step is short, no more than the length of his own foot, and as his weight shifts onto that back foot, the hemp fibres between his hand and the hook pull taut. The slack disappears, and the twist that the hook is imparting travels up the fibres in a tiny, continuous wave, binding the loose strands together into something new. The first inch of yarn forms under his fingers, pale and even and slightly springy, and he feeds more fibres from the bundle at his waist by simply allowing his hand to move backward, drawing the hemp out in a thin, steady stream. You watch this first step and the ones that follow, and you begin to understand the rhythm. The turner cranks the wheel in a circle that never varies, and the hook rotates at a constant speed, and the spinner walks backward one step at a time, his hand holding the forming yarn just ahead of the twist point. The distance between his fingers and the hook grows with each step. An inch, then 2 inches, then a handspan of twisted yarn hanging in the air between them. The yarn is still fragile at this stage, a single thin thread that could be broken with a sharp tug, but no sharp tug comes. The spinner's touch is so light that the fibres seem to flow through his fingers like water through a narrow channel, guided rather than pulled. The sound of the work fills the ropewalk now, a steady, gentle, 3-part rhythm, the creak of the wheel, the whisper of the twisting fibres, and the soft scuff of the spinner's feet on the wooden floor. These sounds are so constant and so evenly spaced that they merge into a kind of silence, the same way the steady fall of rain on a roof eventually becomes unheard. The dust that had settled in the long room is stirred once more, rising in small lazy clouds from the floorboards each time the spinner sets down his foot and the particles catch the light from the high windows, swirling in eddies that drift and disappear. The spinner reaches the end of his first arm's length of yarn, and without pausing, he transfers the forming thread from his right hand to his left, reaching back to his right hip to draw more fibre from the bundle. This is the motion that will be repeated thousands of times today. The right hand pulls a fresh pinch of hemp, the left hand holds the tension, and the backward step continues. The new fibres overlap the old ones inside the twisting zone, their ends interlocking as the hook turns them, and the yarn grows longer without any visible join. It is seamless, this addition of new material, a continuous act of creation that leaves no mark of where one handful ended and the next began. The spinner's face is calm, his mouth slightly open to breathe, his eyes still focused on nothing in particular. He is not thinking about the yarn. The thinking was done years ago when he first learned the craft. Now his body knows what to do, and his mind is free to wander through whatever quiet thoughts a man might have while walking backward on a grey morning. Perhaps he thinks of the river and its tides, perhaps of the small garden behind his cottage where his wife grows rosemary, perhaps of nothing at all. The lack of thought is itself a kind of peace, and you can see it in the relaxed set of his shoulders, the easy swing of his arms. The turner at the wheel has his own rhythm, and he matches it to the spinner's backward pace without any visible communication. He watches the yarn, not the man, keeping the twist rate constant so that the thread neither overspins into kinks nor underspins into weakness. His hand moves the crank in the same circle, over and over, and the muscles of his forearm flex and relax with a regularity that would make a clockmaker envious. He is young but already has the same timeless patience as the spinner, the patience that comes from accepting that a day's work is exactly as long as it needs to be, and no shorter. The first assistant has risen from his stool and walks slowly along the side of the ropewalk, parallel to the spinner's path, but keeping well clear of the forming yarn. He carries a wooden paddle with a long handle, and occasionally he uses it to lift the fine yarn off the floor as it extends behind the spinner, guiding it into a gentle, straight line that will not snag or tangle. The yarn now stretches for perhaps 20 feet, a thin, pale line against the dark wood of the floor, and it quivers slightly with the vibration of the twist travelling back from the distant hook. The assistant's paddle is smooth and worn, and he moves it with the carefulness of someone handling a living thing, which, in a way, this yarn is. It is alive with tension, with stored energy, and if it were to be dropped or snagged, it would recoil into a useless tangle, that would recoil into a useless tangle that would take an hour to sort. But it will not snag, because the floor is clean and the assistant has been doing this for years and his attention never wavers. The light from the high windows has solidified into a steady, cool whiteness, the kind of light that makes shadows soft and edges blur. Outside, the mist is completely lifted, and the sky is a uniform pale grey from horizon to horizon. The river is visible through the windows as a broad sheet of silver, perfectly flat, and the anchored ships have swung slightly on their cables so that they now face the incoming tide. Their masts form a sparse forest of vertical lines against the sky, and the top one of them, a pennant, hangs limp, its colors indistinguishable in the flat light. Nothing moves on the river, no boats cross between the ships, no gulls disturb the surface. The world outside the Ropewalk has paused, and the only motion in the entire visible universe is the slow backward walk of the spinner and the steady turn of the wheel. You shift your weight from one foot to the other, and the floorboard beneath you creaks softly. The sound is startling and quiet, and the spinner's eyes flick toward you for a brief moment, registering your presence without curiosity, and then they return to the middle distance. You are not a distraction. You are simply another part of the background, like the stacked hemp and the hanging coils of rope and the pigeon on its beam. The ropewalk has absorbed you, and you feel the calm of the place seeping into your bones, slowing your thoughts, stretching your sense of time until a minute feels like 10 and 10 minutes feel like an hour. The spinner has now walked backward for perhaps 100 feet, and the single yarn behind him is a long, delicate thread that runs from the iron hook all the way to his hand. It passes through the topmaker's guide that the first assistant has placed on the floor, a small iron plate with a hole that keeps the yarn centered in the walkway. As the spinner continues backward, the assistant moves the guide in careful increments, sliding it along the floor so that it always remains a few feet behind the point of twist. The yarn runs through the hole with a faint, high-pitched hiss. The sound of fibres rubbing against iron and the vibration of the twist makes the guide hum softly. The temperature in the Ropewalk has not changed, but the air feels a little closer now, the scents of hemp and wood and leather and oil combining into a single layered aroma that is the smell of the work. The spinner's leather apron creaks faintly as he moves, and the bundle at his waist has reduced slightly, the outer layers of hemp having been drawn away. The bundle unwinds in a slow spiral from the outside, each rotation of his hand pulling a new layer of fibres free, and the cloth wrapping loosens by imperceptible degrees. When the bundle is half gone, the spinner will stop and re-wrap it, tucking the cloth tighter and repositioning the remaining hemp so that it continues to feed smoothly. That moment is still a long way off, perhaps half an hour or more, and in the meantime the rhythm continues without a single break. The pigeon on the beam has tucked its head under its wing and gone to sleep. The second assistant, still seated on his stool, has taken out a small whetstone and is sharpening the blade of a spare knife with slow circular strokes that send a faint metallic ring into the air before dying away. The sharpening is a maintenance task, not an urgent one, and it is done with the same unhurried care as everything else in this building. The oil from the whetstone smells faintly of minerals, a clean, cold smell that cuts through the heavier hemp scent for a moment and then fades. You notice that the groove in the floor, the shallow, worn track that leads straight down the center of the walkway, is directly beneath the forming yarn. The spinner's feet have walked this groove thousands of times before, and they are walking it now with the same placement, the same weight, the same ankle of the sole. The wood in the groove is slightly darker than the surrounding boards, polished to a low sheen by the friction of leather and hemp dust, and it feels almost like a riverbed worn by a slow, persistent stream. Each of the spinner's steps falls into the groove with a natural, unthinking accuracy, as if the building itself is guiding him. The yarn now stretches for perhaps 200 feet, and the spinner is a small figure in the middle of the long room, framed by the tall windows on either side. The light falls on him in stripes as he passes each window, his figure brightening and then dimming, in a slow, steady cycle that has no beginning and no end. The effect is hypnotic, and you find yourself counting the stripes of light without meaning to, one for each window, each one marking perhaps 10 of his backward steps. The counting lulls you into a deeper state of stillness, and you forget to wonder how long you have been standing there. The turner's arms are beginning to feel the work, a pleasant warmth spreading through his shoulders and down his back, but it is not fatigue. He has been turning the wheel for the same length of time that the spinner has been walking, and his body has settled into the motion just as deeply. He breathes in time with the creak of the wheel, his chest rising and falling in a slow, regular rhythm, and his eyes remain on the twisting yarn. The wheel itself has warmed slightly from the friction of the drive band, and the faint smell of warm leather now mixes with the other scents in the air. The spinner pauses. It is a small pause, a momentary halt in the long backward walk, and it happens so smoothly that you almost do not notice it. He stops because a small knot of fibres has reached his fingers from the bundle, a tangle the size of a pea that would mar the evenness of the yarn if it were twisted in. He pinches the knot out with his fingernails, lets the tangled bit fall to the floor, and then feeds a fresh pinch of hemp into the twist point without losing a single turn of the hook. The pause is only 3 heartbeats long, and then his left foot moves backward again, and the rhythm resumes exactly as before. The piece of tangled hemp lies on the floor, a small pale knot that the assistant will sweep up later, and in the long history of the ropey walk it is entirely unremarkable. The first assistant has returned to his stool, his paddle resting against the wall, and he sits with his hands folded in his lap. He watches the spinner in the same way you are watching, with a calm, diffuse attention that asks for nothing and expects nothing, and expects nothing. The yarn will need his paddle again when the spinner reaches the far end of the walkway, but for now the long, straight run of the floor is doing the work of guiding, and the assistant can rest. He closes his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but simply to rest them from the unchanging light, and the lines of his face soften. The yarn continues to grow, foot by foot, twist by twist, and the morning wears on toward its middle. The bell in the dockyard chapel will not ring again for some time, and when it does, it will be only a marker, a brief note in the steady symphony of the day. Nothing has happened in the ropey walk except the quiet, miraculous transformation of raw hemp into yarn, and nothing will happen except the continuation of that transformation until the spinner's bundle is empty and the long backward walk is done. The calm is absolute, and you breathe it in with every slow rise and fall of your chest, feeling the peace of the place settle over you like a familiar blanket, warm and heavy and entirely without edge. The twist is a small and quiet thing, yet it is the entire reason the ropey walk exists, and the spinner understands it without ever putting that understanding into words. It happens at the point where the loose hemp fibres meet the rotating hook, a convergence of grip and motion that grips the individual strands and wraps them around each other in a continuous spiral. The principle is simple enough that a child could grasp it. When you turn one end of a bundle of fibres while holding the other end steady, the fibres rub together, catch and lock, turning weakness into strength. But the simplicity of the principle conceals a world of tiny adjustments that the spinner's hands make from one heartbeat to the next, and those adjustments are what he has spent a lifetime learning. The twist begins at the hook, where the iron curve rotates in its oil brass bearing with a faint, high ringing that is less a sound than a presence in the air. The hook grips the very first knot that the spinner tied, and as it turns, it wrings the fibres as a washerwoman wrings a cloth, but with far more gentleness and far more control. The torsion travels up the loose hemp in a wave that you can see if you look closely, a subtle spiraling that moves from the hook toward the spinner's hand at the speed of a slow current. The fibres, once straight and separate, begin to lean into each other, their rough surfaces catching and holding, and where they catch they form a tiny bond that will never release. The yarn is born at that precise point where the loose hemp becomes a single coherent thread, and the point moves backward as the spinner walks, always exactly between his fingers and the hook. The spinner's right hand is the gatekeeper of the twist, controlling how many fibres enter the zone at any instant. It hovers near his hip, drawing a steady supply from the bundle, but it never grabs too much. The thumb and forefinger roll the fibres together ever so slightly before releasing them into the twist, a motion so small that you might miss it if you blinked. The left hand, meanwhile, maintains the tension, holding the already formed yarn a few inches behind the twist point with a pressure that varies by the weight of a feather. Too much tension and the yarn will over-twist, becoming hard and kinky and liable to snap. Too little and it will be loose and weak, its fibres failing to grip each other. The spinner knows the right tension not by any instrument, but by the feel of the yarn in his palm, a subtle signal transmitted through the hemp itself, and his left hand adjusts by fractions of an ounce without his conscious mind ever entering the loop. The turner at the great wheel is the distant partner in this conversation of tension. He watches the yarn not as a supervisor watches a worker, but as a musician watches a fellow player, sensing the tempo. If the spinner walks a little slower, the twist might build up too tightly at the hook, unless the wheel slows. If the spinner speeds up, the yarn might not get enough twist to hold together. So the turner's hand on the crank varies almost imperceptibly, a slight hesitation here, a tiny surge there. All of it communicated not by words or gestures, but by the visible quality of the forming yarn. He sees a slight puff of fibres that have not quite caught, and he eases the crank a fraction. He sees a sharp little kink threatening to form, and he speeds it a breath. The two men, spinner and turner, are connected by 100 feet of twisting hemp, and their collaboration is as old and wordless as a dance. The yarn that results from this constant negotiation is a thing of simple beauty. It is pale, almost luminous against the dark floor, and its surface is slightly fuzzy with the tiny ends of fibres that have not fully tucked in. The fuzz catches the light from the high windows in a soft halo, making the yarn look thicker than it really is. When the spinner walks through a shaft of sunlight, the yarn gleams like a silver thread, and you can see the spiral pattern of the twist as a fine diagonal line running its entire length. The pattern is perfectly regular, a testament to the steadiness of the turner and the spinner, and there are no thin spots or lumps anywhere along the span you can see. The yarn is so even that it seems almost artificial, but it is not. It is the product of nothing more than hands and walking and attention sustained over time. The spinner's feet continue their slow backward progress, and the point of twist moves with them. You watch his shoe come down on the wooden floor and see how the board beneath it barely flexes. So solid is the construction of the walkway. The sound of each step is a soft, dry scuff that echoes faintly in the long room. But because the room is so long, the echo arrives late and degraded, a ghost of a sound that blends with the original, so that the two are indistinguishable. The floorboards, worn smooth by centuries of this very motion, are almost frictionless under his leather soles, and he walks with the yielding, balanced gait of a man who could do this in his sleep. Which in a way he does, because the part of his brain that is active right now is the same part that runs his breathing and his heartbeat. The tension in the yarn is not only a matter of the spinner's hands, it is also stored in the long length that now trails behind him all the way to the hook. The yarn is under a constant, gentle pull, a force no greater than the weight of a small book, and this pull keeps it straight and clear of the floor. The first assistant has placed small wooden rollers under the yarn at intervals, simple spools that let the thread run over them with almost no friction, and these prevent the yarn from sagging onto the dusty boards where it might pick up grit. The rollers are turned from beechwood, light and pale, and they spin with a faint whirring sound as the yarn passes over them, a sound that is just on the edge of hearing. Each roller is seated in a simple iron bracket that fits into a hole in the floor, and they were placed by the assistant during one of his slow walks up and down the ropewalk, his paddle guiding the yarn into the correct line. The spinner reaches the point where his bundle is half empty, and he stops his backward walk without any abruptness, simply ceasing to move as if the music that drives him has paused. The turner stops cranking at the same instant, the wheel coming to rest with a soft wooden thump as the drive band slackens. The yarn hangs in the air between them, still under tension, quivering slightly. The spinner untucks the cloth of his waist bundle, rewinds it tighter around the remaining hemp, and tucks it in again, his fingers moving with the quick precision of a seamstress. Then he draws a fresh pinch of fibres, tucks it into the standing yarn, and gives the turner a glance that is nothing more than a slight lift of the chin. The wheel begins to turn again, the twist resumes, and the spinner's left foot moves backward, continuing the long journey. The pause has lasted perhaps 20 seconds, and the rhythm re-establishes itself as if it had never broken. The air in the ropewalk now holds a fine haze of hemp dust that has been raised by the spinner's passage. The dust is so light that it barely falls. It drifts in the still air, catching the light and making the long shafts from the windows look solid, like sloping pillars of pale gold. The dust smells faintly sweet and faintly sharp, and with each breath you take a few particles settle in your nose and throat, not unpleasantly, leaving a dry sensation that makes you want to swallow. The spinner must swallow often because his mouth is constantly exposed to the dust, but he does so without breaking stride, a reflex as automatic as blinking. The assistants, too, are accustomed to the dust, and they breathe through their noses with the practiced air of those who work in textile rooms. The twist continues, coil after coil, foot after foot, and the single yarn grows longer. It has now reached the length where the spinner is a distant figure at the far end of the ropey walk, and from where you stand near the middle you can see the entire line stretching like a taut string across the vast room. The yarn is no thicker than a heavy sewing thread, and you marvel that something so thin can be the foundation of a ship's rope that will hold against the weight of a full sail in a gale. But the secret is in the layering that will come later. This single yarn will be twisted with others to form a strand, and several strands will be twisted together to form the final rope, and each stage adds its own twist, its own tension, its own strength. The single yarn is only the first note in a long chord, but it must be perfectly in tune or the whole chord will be false. The spinner's attention, which never wavers, is divided between two sensations: the feel of the hemp slipping through his right hand and the feel of the finished yarn in his left. The hemp is cool and slightly rough, with a texture like dry grass, and it slides through his fingers with a faint rustle. The yarn, by contrast, is warm from the friction of the twist, and it is smooth and springy, like a strand of living sinew. The contrast tells him that the twist is doing its work, that the fibres are aligning and gripping, and he trusts the contrast more than he would trust any gauge. Every few minutes he passes the yarn through his left thumb and forefinger, feeling for any thin spot or lump, and so far there have been none. The day's first yarn is a good one, and it will make a good rope. The turner, too, feels the quality of the work through the resistance of the crank. A well-twisting yarn pulls smoothly with a constant, gentle resistance that is actually pleasant to work against, like the weight of a well-balanced tool. A poorly twisting one jerks and stutters, demanding constant corrections. Today the resistance is perfectly smooth, and the turner's arm moves in its steady circle with the ease of a wheel rolling downhill, though the wheel is not downhill but level, and the force comes entirely from his own muscle. He has grown so accustomed to the motion that his arm feels strange if he stops, a mild restlessness that can only be soothed by resuming the crank, and he knows that later in the day, when the work is done, he will feel the ghost of the motion in his muscles as he walks home. The light changes by a minute degree. A small thinning of the cloud cover allows a slightly brighter quality to enter the windows, and the dust motes glow more intensely. The shadows of the window frames on the floor sharpen a little, then soften again as the cloud thickens once more. The weather is indecisive, but inside the ropey walk, the weather does not matter. The temperature stays constant, and the light is always sufficient. The spinner does not notice the change because his eyes are set on a point just ahead of his hand, and his peripheral vision has long ago stopped registering the slow dance of the clouds. The yarn continues to extend, and the first assistant reappears, walking quietly along the side of the walkway to check the rollers. He bends to each one, giving it a small spin with his finger to ensure it turns freely, and he brushes away a speck of dust that has settled on one of the brackets. His progress is as slow and methodical as the spinner's, and he hums a tune under his breath, so quietly that you cannot identify the melody. It is just a low, tuneless murmur that blends with the creak of the wheel. The tune is one he learned as a child, and he hums it without knowing he hums it, the way a cat purrs when it is content. The spinner hears the humming and does not hear it, accepting it as part of the fabric of the long room. You take a step closer to the forming yarn, careful to stay well to the side, and you look at the point of twist itself. It is a tiny thing, a dancing intersection where loose hemp becomes yarn, and it is in constant motion. The fibres, pale and separate, are drawn into the rotating bundle and disappear, merging seamlessly, and the newly formed yarn emerges on the other side, tight and smooth. The transition takes a fraction of a second for each individual fibre, but the process is continuous, so it looks like a small stationary storm of white lines that is always moving, yet always in the same place relative to the spinner's hand. You could watch it for hours, and the spinner has watched it for years, and it never grows old. The tension in the yarn is a living thing. It hums when you pluck it, though no one plucks it now, and it responds to every tiny variation in the turner's speed and the spinner's pace, with a slight tightening or loosening that travels the length in a wave. The spinner can read those waves through his left hand, and they tell him everything he needs to know. A sudden slack wave might mean the turner has slowed, and the spinner will slow his walk a fraction to compensate. A sharp tension wave might mean a catch at the hook, and the turner will feel it too, and adjust. This communication is so fast and so subtle that to an outsider it looks like magic, but it is not magic. It is simply attention stretched over time until it becomes instinct. The morning has now advanced to the point where the light has reached its full daytime quality, and the Ropewalk is filled with a steady, diffused brightness that makes everything clear and soft at once. The bricks of the walls show their variations of color, ranging from a rusty red to a pale orange, and the mortar between them is a soft gray that has crumbled slightly in places. The high ceiling beams, rough-hewn and dark with age, bear the faint marks of the adzes that shaped them long ago. The dust in the air has settled a little, and the smell of hemp is now the dominant note. Constant and calming, the smell of a barn at the end of summer. The spinner has another hour of walking before the single yarn is complete, and he will walk that hour with the same steadiness he has shown since the first step. He does not count the time, because to count time is to make it feel long, and what he does instead is let the time flow through him, using his body as a clock that needs no winding. His heartbeat, his breathing, the swing of his arms and the scuff of his feet all keep their own time, and the wheel keeps its time, and somewhere a distant bell will keep its time, and all these times align into a single peaceful rhythm that has no end. The morning has settled fully into its steady routine, and the Ropewalk, which at first appeared an empty tunnel of brick and wood, now contains a quiet population of men moving in the same slow backward direction along parallel paths. You had not noticed the others arrive, so absorbed were you in the single spinner and his single yarn, but at some point during the long minutes of watching the twist, you became aware that the sounds in the building had multiplied and softened into a gentle, layered murmur. There are 4 spinners at work now, each with his own wheel, his own turner, his own bundle of hemp, and they occupy the 4 lanes that the wide wooden floor can accommodate, without any crowding. They move like the hands of separate clocks that all keep the same time, stepping backward in unison, but not in lockstep, their rhythms overlapping and diverging and overlapping again in a pattern too slow and too complex for the conscious mind to track. The lanes are marked not by lines of paint, but by the faint parallel grooves worn into the floorboards by generations of backward feet, each groove spaced exactly the width of a man's shoulders from the next. The spinner you have been watching occupies the lane nearest the river windows, and in the lane beside him a slightly younger man with a greying beard walks backward with exactly the same patient gait, drawing his own yarn from his own bundle. In the 3rd lane an older spinner, his face deeply creased and his movements a shade slower, pauses to cough into the crook of his elbow before resuming his step without a break in the tension. The 4th lane holds a tall, thin spinner who hums a low, continuous note that matches the pitch of his wheel's creak. All 4 are dressed similarly in wool caps, linen shirts, knee breeches and leather aprons, and all 4 have the same calm, inward expression, as if each man walks alone in a private world of hemp and twist. Yet they are all together, sharing the long room like monks sharing a cloister. The turners of the wheels form a row at the near end of the ropewalk, 4 young men standing at their cranks, their arms moving in the same circular motion but at slightly different phases, so that the 4 wheels do not creak in perfect unison, but in a rolling, overlapping wave of sound. The creaking is deeper now, not a single note, but a chord, and it fills the space under the high ceiling with a resonance that you can feel in your chest. The drive bands, 4 leather straps of varying ages and darknesses, slip and grip and slip and grip, and the iron hooks spin in their brass bearings, and the 4 yarns, pale and taut, stretch away toward the distant far door like the strings of some immense, quiet instrument. The floorboards transmit the vibrations of all 4 wheels, and if you stand perfectly still, you can feel a faint humming through the soles of your own shoes. The air in the Ropewalk has warmed by several degrees, not from any change in the weather outside, but from the accumulated heat of 8 working bodies and the constant friction of hemp against hemp. The warmth is pleasant rather than oppressive, a mild, stable increase that makes the space feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. The scent of hemp, which was already strong, has deepened into something richer and more complex, with undertones of warm skin, wool, leather, and the faint mineral tang of oiled iron. The dust stirred by the morning's preparations has mostly settled, but a fine haze still hangs in the upper reaches of the room, catching the light and making the ceiling seem farther away than it is. The tall windows, now fully bright with the flat white glow of the overcast sky, illuminate everything evenly, without glare, and the world outside remains a still picture of grey water and grey ships. The spinners do not look at each other. Their attention is fixed on the points of twist just ahead of their hands, those tiny dancing intersections where loose hemp becomes yarn, and they maintain their separation not out of unfriendliness, but out of necessity, because the work demands a focus that cannot be shared. Yet they are aware of each other in the indirect way that people in a quiet room are always aware of others, through peripheral vision and the subtle cues of sound and movement. If one spinner pauses to adjust his bundle, the others may slow their pace almost imperceptibly, not in imitation but in a kind of sympathetic rhythm. The way birds in a flock adjust their flight without any obvious signal. The pause passes, the rhythm resumes, and the 4 backward walks continue as if they are all parts of a single, distributed body. The assistants walk the aisles between the lanes, stepping carefully over the taut yarns, carrying armfuls of dressed hemp to replenish bundles, or collecting the finished single yarns at the far end. They move with the quiet efficiency of men who know that speed is less important than care, and their footfalls are as soft as the spinners. The youngest assistant, the one who sweeps the floor, has switched his broom for a wooden paddle with a long handle, and he uses it to guide the newly formed yarns into their proper lines, ensuring that none drifts into a neighbour's lane. The lanes must remain separate, because a crossed yarn would tangle with its neighbour, and untangling a twist under tension is a tedious labour that would interrupt everyone. But no yarns cross today, because the assistants are vigilant and the floor grooves are true. Time inside the ropewalk has lost its familiar shape. The hour that just passed feels indistinguishable from the hour before it, and the hour that is coming will be indistinguishable from both. The only markers of duration are the slow shrinking of the hemp bundles at the spinners' waists and the steady lengthening of the yarns behind them. The spinner you have been watching has now consumed 3/4 of his original bundle, and the cloth wrapping hangs loosely from his belt, ready to be rewound. The yarn trailing from his hand to the hook is so long that you cannot see its entire length from any single position. It disappears into the middle distance, a fine pale line against the dark floor, and the far end is only a concept, a theoretical point where the twist began perhaps an hour ago. The length is measured not in feet, but in time, and by that measure the yarn is now many minutes long. The rhythmic sounds of the long room have begun to work on you, in the way that steady, repetitive sounds always work on a quiet mind. The creaking of the wheels, the scuff of the backward feet, the soft hiss of hemp passing through the Ropemaker's guides. These sounds have ceased to be individual events and have merged into a continuous auditory texture, like the sound of a distant waterfall or the wind in a forest. Your breathing has slowed to match the rhythm without your intending it, and your eyelids have grown slightly heavy, though you are not tired. The peace of the ropewalk is a contagious peace, and it spreads from the spinners outward, filling every corner and every observer. The pigeon on its beam has tucked its head completely under its wing and sleeps without stirring. One of the spinners, the older man in the third lane, finishes his single yarn. He does so without any ceremony, simply walking the last few backward steps until his bundle is empty and the final pinch of hemp has twisted into the standing yarn. He nods to his turner, who stops cranking, and the wheel coasts to a halt with a few soft clicks as the drive band slackens. The spinner unties his empty cloth, folds it neatly, and hands it to an assistant who has appeared at his side. Then he clips the finished yarn at the hook with a pair of iron shears and ties the free end in a small loose knot to prevent unraveling. The yarn, now detached, lies on the floor in a long, straight line, waiting to be collected. Another assistant begins to coil it carefully onto a wooden spool, walking slowly along its length and turning the spool by hand, a process that will take many minutes and require no particular thought. The older spinner stretches his arms once, rolls his shoulders, and walks to the bench to refill his bundle for the next yarn. His rest will be short, and then he will join the backward walk again, a new yarn beginning where the old one ended. The spinner you have been watching has reached the point where his own bundle is nearly empty, and he makes the familiar pause to rewrap the cloth. He untucks it, draws the remaining hemp into a tighter, more compact shape, and tucks it in again, all without ever setting down the standing yarn. The turner has slowed the wheel to a crawl, giving the twist just enough motion to keep the yarn from untwisting, and the spinner takes advantage of the slower pace to wipe his forehead with the back of his hand, leaving a faint smudge of hemp dust on his temple. Then he draws a fresh pinch of fibres, reattaches himself to the twist point, and signals with a chin lift. The wheel speeds up, the foot moves backward, and the long walk resumes as if nothing had happened. The interruption to the rhythm was so brief and so gentle that you are not sure it even deserves to be called an interruption. The light through the high windows has begun to shift in the way that afternoon light shifts, though noon is still some way off. The quality of the brightness is still diffuse and grey, but the angle has changed by a few degrees, and the shafts of light that fall through the dusty panes now strike the floor at a slightly different slant. The difference is so subtle that only someone who has been standing still for a long time would notice it. And you are that someone. The shadows of the window frames have crept a few inches across the boards, and the dust motes that float in the beams are now illuminated from a new direction, making them sparkle where before they merely glowed. The spinner does not notice the shift because his world is bounded by the yarn in his hands, but you notice, and it is a quiet marker of the day's slow passage. The sounds of the dockyard outside remain muted and distant. Once, a voice called something across the basin, a single word that was swallowed by the distance before its meaning could reach the ropewalk. Once, a heavy object fell somewhere with a thud that echoed briefly, and then died. These external sounds are like pebbles dropped into a still pond, and the ropewalk absorbs them without a ripple, returning immediately to its steady creak and scuff. The ceasefire has made the whole yard quiet, but the ropewalk would be quiet even in wartime, because rope cannot be hurried and the men who make it cannot be rushed. You walk slowly along the edge of the room, staying close to the wall, feeling the cool brick against your shoulder. From this new angle you can see the 4 spinners in profile, their faces lit by the windows, their hands moving in identical rhythms. They are like a frieze carved into the long wall of a temple, figures engaged in a timeless act, and if you squint your eyes, the image blurs into a single repeated form. The yarns behind them are nearly invisible against the floor, but you know they are there because you can see the tiny wooden rollers at their intervals spinning with a barely perceptible motion. The rollers make a sound that is just on the edge of hearing, a faint whir like the sound of insects in a meadow on a summer evening, except that it is not summer and there are no insects, only wood and hemp and careful hands. The warmth in the room has become a constant, and you notice that one of the assistants has opened a small vent near the ceiling, a wooden flap that allows a thin stream of cool outside air to enter and drift downward. The fresh air carries a hint of the river, salt and mud, and it cuts through the hemp-scented warmth like a drink of cold water, cleansing your palate before the hemp smell closes over it again. The vent will remain open for perhaps half an hour, and then the assistant will close it before the room becomes too chilly, maintaining the temperature within a narrow band that the hemp likes best. Hemp that is too cold becomes stiff and difficult to twist. Hemp that is too warm becomes limp and loses its grip. The ropemakers have learned this over centuries, and they tend the climate of the ropewalk as carefully as they tend the tension of the yarn. You find yourself standing near the far end of the walkway, where the finished single yarns are being coiled onto spools by the assistants. The spools are large wooden drums with handles on one side, and they turn with a soft, regular clicking as the yarn accumulates in neat layers. The assistant doing the coiling walks backward too, pulling the spool with him as he follows the yarn along the floor, and his motion is a mirror of the spinner's motion, slower but equally steady. The yarn passes through his guiding hand, which ensures that it lays evenly on the spool without gaps or overlaps, and the coil grows in thickness with each pass. The finished spools will be taken to the next stage, where several yarns will be twisted together into strands. But that is work for another day, or perhaps for later this afternoon. And right now the spools simply accumulate in a neat row against the wall, each one a record of a spinner's morning. The bell in the dockyard chapel rings again, a single low tone that rolls through the still air and through the high windows, marking the passage of another hour. No one in the ropewalk reacts to it, because the hour is an artificial boundary that has no meaning here. The work continues as long as there is hemp to twist and light to see by, and neither the bell nor the clock it serves can alter that. The bell fades, and the silence that follows is not true silence, but the familiar texture of wheel creaks and foot scuffs and hemp rustle, all of it so constant and so expected that your mind has already filed it under silence. You lean against the cool brick wall and let your eyes rest on the nearest spinner, whose calm face and steady hands are as soothing as any lullaby, and you feel the deep, slow rhythm of the long room pulling you gently into its own timeless time, where minutes have no weight and sleep is always hovering just below the surface of things. The morning has used itself up in the slow consumption of hemp and minutes, and now the light through the high windows has reached that particular angle, that particular color, which tells the body before the mind that noon has arrived. The long shafts of dust-filled brightness, which earlier slanted from the east, have straightened and shortened until they fall almost vertically through the glass, and the shadows of the window frames on the wooden floor have shrunk to dark puddles directly beneath their sills. The quality of the light itself has changed, losing the silver coolness of early day and taking on a whiter, more neutral tone that flattens the texture of the brick walls and makes the taut yarns gleam like filaments of spun glass. Nothing dramatic has marked the passage from morning to midday. There was no fanfare, no sudden shift, only the steady accumulation of tiny changes in the angle of the sun behind the overcast sky. The ropewalk absorbs this new light without acknowledgement, continuing its fourfold rhythm of creaking wheels and backward steps. And yet, there is a subtle shift in the tempo of the work that only someone who has been standing still for hours would notice. The spinners, who have been walking backward since the early greyness, now move with a heavier, more settled pace, the first edge of morning freshness having worn away. Their motions are no less precise, no less attentive, but they carry a deeper, more rooted quality, as if they have sunk further into the trance of their labour. The bundles at their waists are smaller now, many having been rewrapped once or twice, and the yarns behind them stretch so far that the turners at the far end appear as small figures in a perspective painting. The dust has mostly settled out of the air, leaving a clarity that makes every detail distinct, and the smell of hemp, so sharp and green this morning, has mellowed into a softer, drier scent, like hay that has lain in a loft through a whole summer. Outside the ropewalk, across the cobblestones and the timber piers, the greater dockyard has entered its own midday hush, a quiet that is different from the quiet of the morning because it carries the weight of the morning behind it. The river, which earlier moved with the sluggish purpose of the incoming tide, has now reached its slack water, that pause between flow and ebb when the current forgets which way to go. The surface of the Medway is a sheet of polished pewter, beaten flat by the grey sky, and the reflections of the anchored ships are so still and so perfect that they look like solid objects submerged just beneath the skin of the water. The ships themselves, great wooden vessels of the line with their gun ports closed and their yards squared, ride at their moorings without any sign of life. No sailors scrub the decks, no officers pace the quarter-decks, no boats row between the hulls. The pennants at the mastheads droop in the windless air, their colours muted to indistinguishable shades of grey. The whole fleet rests, and the dockyard rests with it. The sail lofts, which stand in a long row near the basin, are silent and shuttered, their great upper floors empty of the sailmakers who would normally be spreading canvas across the broad wooden floors. The masthouses, where the tall pines from the Baltic are stored and shaped, have their doors closed, and no sound of adze or plane emerges from within. The smithy, with its forge and anvil, has banked its fire for the midday meal, and the chimney, that earlier sent up a thin wisp of smoke, now sends up nothing at all. The timber stacks, huge squared logs of oak and elm piled in neat rows to season, smell of damp wood and resin in the still air, and a single dockyard cat, grey and lean, walks along the top of the piles with the slow, indifferent grace of its kind. It finds a sunny spot, though the sun is only a diffuse brightness behind the clouds, and curls into a tight ball, its tail covering its nose. The quayside is empty of carts and wagons. The cranes, great wooden structures with their ropes and pulleys, stand idle, their hooks hanging motionless above the water. The cobblestones, which were damp with mist this morning, have dried to a pale grey, and the puddles that gathered in the low spots are gone. A few gulls stand on the bollards, their heads tucked, their eyes half closed, and they do not stir as you look at them through the dusty panes of the ropewalk window. The whole yard, spread out along the curve of the river, has entered a state of suspended animation, a collective pause in which nothing is demanded and nothing is urgent. The ceasefire, which has held for weeks now, has allowed this deep, midday stillness to settle over everything like a thick blanket, and the only movement in the entire visible world is the quiet, steady motion inside the long brick building where the rope is made. Inside that building, the midday pause arrives not as a bell or a shouted order, but as a shared, unspoken agreement among the workers. The turner nearest the door eases his crank to a halt, and the great wheel slows with a soft clicking sigh as the drive band relaxes. The spinner in that lane feels the tension slacken, and stops his backward walk at the same moment, lowering his hands to his sides and letting the standing yarn rest gently on the nearest wooden roller. The other spinners, sensing the shift in the rhythm through the subtle vibrations of the floor and the change in the creaking pattern, also stop, one after another, their pauses cascading down the length of the rope you walk, like the last notes of a slow piece of music. The 4 yarns hang in the air, still taut but no longer vibrating, and the wheels stand motionless, their iron hooks frozen in mid-twist. The silence that descends is deeper than the silence that preceded the day's work, because it is a silence chosen, a rest that has been earned by hours of steady labor. The spinners walk to the bench where they left their belongings, not hurrying, their footsteps now forward instead of backward, which feels briefly strange to them, a small reversal of a pattern that has been set into their bones. The older spinner sits down with a slow, deliberate folding of his legs, and he lets out a breath that is not quite a sigh, merely a release of the focused tension that has held his shoulders for the past several hours. He reaches into a linen bag that hangs from the bench peg and pulls out a small loaf of bread, dark and dense, and a wedge of hard cheese wrapped in a clean cloth. The other spinners find their own provisions, an apple, a strip of dried fish, a leather bottle of small beer, a handful of walnuts. They eat without conversation, not out of any unfriendliness, but because there is nothing that needs saying. The sharing of the quiet is enough. The younger spinner, the one in the second lane, pours water from a clay jug into a wooden cup that has been passed down through his family, its rim worn smooth by many lips. The water is cool from sitting on the brick floor, and he drinks it slowly, feeling it move down his throat and into his chest. The tall spinner with the humming habit sits with his back against the wall, his eyes closed, his hands resting open on his knees, and he does not eat, only breathes, storing up stillness for the afternoon. The spinner you have been watching all morning eats his bread and cheese in small, methodical bites, and when he is finished, he wipes his hands on the front of his apron and drinks from his own leather bottle. The liquid inside, dark and slightly bitter, a tea made from herbs, his wife gathers in the hedgerows near their cottage. The scent of the tea, faintly floral and earthy, rises into the hemp-scented air and then fades. The turners and assistants also take their rest, sitting on the floor or on the low stools, their young bodies grateful for the pause. The youngest assistant, the one who sweeps, has stretched out on his back on a pile of empty sacking, his hands folded behind his head, and he stares up at the high ceiling beams without seeing them, his mind drifting through whatever quiet thoughts a boy drifts through when he is tired and content. The grease from the turner's cranks has left dark marks on their palms, and they rub their hands together absently, feeling the warmth of the worked muscles beneath the skin. The pigeon on its beam has woken from its morning sleep and preens its feathers, the soft rustle of its beak through the plumage, adding a tiny, scratchy note to the silence. You stand by the window and watch the dockyard through the dusty glass, and you feel the midday hush enter your own body. The river is so still now that it looks solid, a sheet of grey metal poured between the banks, and the far shore is a hazy line of green and brown. A single small boat, a herry with a solitary oarsman, crosses the river with strokes so slow and so steady that it seems to take minutes to move a boat length. The oars dip without a splash, and the ripples they make are the only disturbance on the entire surface, spreading in slow arcs that fade before they reach the shore. The oarsman does not look up, and his face is hidden under a wide-brimmed hat, and in a moment he is gone behind the hull of the nearest ship, and the river is once again a perfect, unbroken mirror. The air inside the rope you walk, warmed by the morning's labour, has begun to cool slightly as the open vent admits a thin stream of outside air. The fresh air carries the smell of the river, salt and mud, and the faint, distant smell of smoke from the banked forge, and it stirs the hemp dust that lies on the floor, lifting a few pale particles into a lazy spiral. The temperature drops by a degree, perhaps two, and the change is just enough to make the space feel refreshed rather than chill. The assistant who opened the vent will close it before the afternoon work begins, but for now he leaves it as it is, and the cross breeze moves gently through the length of the building, carrying away some of the staleness of the morning. The spinner who finished his yarn earlier, the older man with the deeply creased face, does not eat. He has taken his refilled bundle and is already standing beside his wheel, checking the drive band, testing the hook, preparing himself in the same quiet way he did this morning. He does not wish to rush, but he knows that the afternoon's work will be long, and he prefers to begin a little before the others, letting the rhythm find him again, without the pressure of expectation. He tucks the cloth bundle around his waist, draws the first pinch of hemp, and ties it to the hook. He does not signal the turner, because the turner is still eating his bread, and so he simply waits, his hand resting on the wheel's rim, his eyes on the far door. The rest has not broken his concentration, but only deepened it, and he is ready. The bell in the dockyard chapel does not ring for midday. It rang earlier for another hour, and it will ring again in the afternoon. But noon itself is marked only by the stillness, which is perhaps the truest way to mark a pause. The sun behind the clouds has reached its highest point, and for a few minutes the shadows are at their minimum, small dark shapes huddled at the bases of things. Then the sun begins its slow descent toward the west, though the change is not yet perceptible, and the afternoon light will be a long, slow version of the morning light, differing only in its direction and its warmth. The spinner you have been watching finishes his tea, puts away his cup, and rises from the bench. He rolls his shoulders once, twice, feeling the muscles loosen, and he walks back to his lane with the same measured gait he used when he first entered this morning. The bundle at his waist is a new one, freshly filled by an assistant while he ate, and it sits full and heavy against his hip. He takes his position behind his chalk mark, draws the first pinch of fibres, and reaches for the hook. His turner has also risen and stands at the crank, his hands gripping the wood, his eyes already on the forming yarn that has not yet begun to form. The pause is over, and the long afternoon is about to commence. As quiet and as steady as the morning that came before it, a continuation of the same eternal rhythm beneath the unchanging grey sky. The afternoon has a different texture than the morning, not because anything has changed in the weather or the light, but because the hours that came before have settled into the bones of the long building, giving the air a slight, comfortable tiredness that is not unpleasant. The same grey sky, the same still river, the same silent ships, all persist out beyond the high windows, and inside the Ropemaking, the same 4 pairs of men work at the same wheels in the same lanes. And yet the work itself has shifted into a new phase, as the single yarns that occupied the morning are now ready to become something larger, a gathering of thin threads into a thicker whole, and this gathering requires a slightly different kind of attention from the spinner you have been watching all day. His single yarns, the long pale threads he spent the morning drawing from his bundle and twisting step by backward step, have been coiled neatly onto wooden spools by the assistants during the midday pause and the early stretch of the afternoon. Those spools now sit in a simple rack beside his wheel, 3 of them mounted on iron pins that let them turn freely as the yarn unwinds, each spool holding enough thread to stretch the full length of the Ropemaking several times over. The yarn on the spools is the product of his morning, and he knows every inch of it by the feel in his left hand. Though he does not think about it in those terms, it is simply his work, and now it must become the next part of the next work, the forming of a strand. The spinner's waist no longer carries the rolled bundle of raw hemp. That bundle has been set aside, its cloth empty and folded, because for this stage of the making he does not feed loose fibres into the twist. Instead, he guides 3 existing yarns, drawing them together through a wooden block with 3 smooth holes, called a register, that sits on the floor a few feet behind his starting mark. The yarns pass through the register in parallel, each coming from its own spool, and as they emerge on the spinner's side, they run together toward his right hand, which holds them in a loose bunch, and then to his left hand, which grips the forming strand just ahead of the twist point. The hook of the spinning wheel, The same iron hook that this morning turned a single wisp of hemp into yarn now rotates with the 3 yarns knotted together on its curve, and as it turns, the 3 yarns wrap around one another in a slower, broader spiral, their individual twists combining and counter-twisting to form a single balanced strand that is springy and strong and visibly more substantial than any one of its parts. The register block is a simple thing, a flat rectangle of oak with 3 holes drilled in a row, each hole lined with a ring of polished horn to reduce friction. The yarns slide through the horn rings with a faint, clean hiss that is higher and softer than the sound of raw hemp twisting, and this new sound joins the ongoing music of the ropewalk as a descent cant above the deeper creak of the wheel. The assistant who tends the rack ensures that the spools turn without jerking, keeping the yarns at a steady, even tension before they reach the register. And he does this by resting a light hand on the rims of the spools, feeling the pull, ready to ease any sudden snag that never comes because the yarns are well made and the spools are well wound. The turner at the great wheel adjusts his pace because twisting 3 yarns together requires a different speed than twisting raw hemp. The strand must receive exactly enough twist to hold the yarns firmly in their spiral without over-twisting them into kinks, and the correct rate is a little slower than the morning spin, a deep, deliberate turn that makes the wheel's creak drop in pitch and lengthen in duration. The turner leans into the crank with a wider, more rolling motion of his shoulder, his entire arm describing a slow circle, and the sound that results is like a heavy wooden door opening and closing far away, a steady, rhythmic groan that you can feel through the floorboards in your feet. The spinner matches this slower pace with a slower backward walk, his steps longer and more measured, each footfall planted with a deliberate softness, and the distance he covers in a minute is perhaps 2/3 of what it was this morning. The strand that forms under his hands is a different creature from the single yarn, where the yarn was fine and almost transparent, a pale line that disappeared against the floor. The strand is a robust cord with a diameter you could measure with your fingers, and its surface shows a distinct regular spiral pattern that catches the light in a rhythmic flash every few inches. The color has deepened from pale straw to a warm honey, because the 3 yarns, each with its own slight variation in shade, combine into a richer tone, and the twist creates tiny shadows at the points where one yarn crosses another. The strand is springy to the touch, and if the spinner were to release the tension for a moment, which he does not, the strand would twist back on itself with a lively curl. But he never releases. His left hand holds the tension constantly, and the strand flows from his grip as a straight, quivering, live thing that grows longer with each backward step. The afternoon light, which earlier stood overhead, has now begun its slow migration toward the west, though the overcast sky prevents any visible sun, and the windows show only a uniform grey field. The angle of the light as it enters the panes has shifted enough that the shadows of the window frames now stretch a little to the east, climbing up the opposite wall in faint, elongated parallelograms. The dust that was stirred this morning has settled everywhere, and the new work raises less of it because the yarns are already spun and dressed, so the air is clearer now, the long shafts of light less populated with floating motes, giving the ropewalk a clean, muted clarity. The brick walls appear sharper, the wood grain of the floor more distinct, and the moving figures of the spinners stand out against the grey windows like figures in a painting made from earth and water. The spinner's attention has shifted its focus. This morning it was spread between the bundle of hemp at his waist and the twist point before him. Now it narrows to the single point where the 3 yarns converge and wrap around each other. A small, busy intersection of movement that requires constant, minute adjustments. If he feels one yarn growing slack, he increases the tension on that yarn with a slight pinch of his right hand, guiding it to take a tighter path. If another yarn seems to be bearing too much load, he eases it with a gentle, almost imperceptible relaxation of his finger. These corrections are as small as anything he did with the raw hemp, but they are different in kind because the yarns are already twisted and have their own stored energy, and they respond to his touch with a readiness that loose fibres lack. The spinner listens to the strand through his left palm, feeling the faint vibrations of the turner's speed, the friction of the yarns in the register, and the evenness of the twist, all travelling up the cord like messages along a taut string, and his body answers those messages without sending them through his conscious mind. The strand trailing behind the spinner is now many feet long, and it passes over the same wooden rollers that guided the single yarn this morning, though the rollers must be spaced a little further apart to support the heavier cord without letting it sag. The first assistant has adjusted the roller positions, sliding them along the floor brackets with a soft, dry squeak of wood on wood, and now the strand rides just above the boards at a height of perhaps 2 inches, high enough to stay clean, low enough to be out of the way. The rollers spin with a deeper whir than before, a low-pitched hum that blends with the wheel's groan, and the strand's spiral surface gives the rolling a faint, regular pulse that you can see in the flicker of the roller's shadow on the floor. The other spinners in the other lanes are also forming strands now, each at his own pace, and the combined sounds of the 4 wheels turning at slightly different, slower speeds creates a layered drone that is surprisingly restful, like a choir of distant cellos all holding the same note with slight variations. The yarns from their spools run through their own register blocks, and the air is filled with the soft hiss of many strands being born. The scent of hemp and oil and wood, now so familiar that you no longer notice it as a smell, but as a quality of the air itself. A constant, grounding presence. The assistants walk the aisles with quiet steps, carrying fresh spools when a rack runs low, removing the empty ones with a gentle clatter, and the whole operation proceeds with the smoothness of water moving through a mill race, steady and untroubled. The spinner you are watching has now walked halfway down his lane, the strand behind him, a long, heavy, living cable that quivers slightly with the stored energy of its twist, and he pauses for a moment to wipe his forehead with the back of his hand. The pause is so brief that the turner barely adjusts, merely slowing the wheel by a single revolution, and then the backward walk resumes, the feet finding the worn groove in the floorboards with the same unthinking accuracy as before. The bundle of raw hemp is gone from his waist, and without its bulk he moves a little more freely, his spine a little more upright, though the work of guiding 3 living threads is no less demanding in its way. The muscles of his left forearm, which has held the tension all day, show a slight, steady fatigue that is not pain, but the pleasant ache of a limb that has done its work well and will soon rest. The strand that he is forming today is not the final rope, it is itself a component, a single strand that will later be twisted with another strand or 2 to make the heaviest cable, the kind that holds anchors and lifts great sails. The spinner knows this, and he works with the knowledge that his strand must be perfect, because the final rope cannot be better than the strands that compose it, and the strand cannot be better than the yarns that compose it, and the yarns cannot be better than the hemp and the twisting and the attention of the morning. This layering of care, in which each stage depends on the ones before and supports the ones after, is the whole philosophy of the rope you walk, and it requires nothing more than that each man do his small part with a steady hand and a quiet mind, asking no reward beyond the evenness of his product. Outside the tall windows, the river has begun its ebb, the tide slipping back toward the sea with a slow, silent purpose that is visible only in the changing angle of the ship's mooring cables and the gradual exposure of the muddy bank below the quay. The gulls that slept on the bollards this morning have woken and taken to the air, riding the faintest of breezes in wide, effortless circles, their cries distant and softened by the glass, and they call to each other with a sound that is not loud but far away, another layer in the afternoon's quiet symphony. The dockyard cat has moved from the timber stack to a sunny spot on the window sill of the sail loft, and it washes its paw with slow, methodical licks. The motion is repetitive and calming as the spinner's backward walk. The spinner's shadow, which earlier was short and pulled at his feet, now stretches along the floor to the east, a soft-edged shape that moves with him step by step, elongating as the afternoon progresses. It has no features, that shadow, only the outline of a man walking slowly backward, and it glides over the floorboards and the rollers and the taut strand without ever overtaking them, a silent companion that has been with him since the morning and will stay with him until the light fails. Watching the shadow is like watching a slower, darker version of the spinner himself, a ghost of the work that mirrors every motion without effort or choice. The warmth of the afternoon has grown by a degree, the accumulated heat of the moving bodies and the friction of the yarns and the steady turning of the wheels raising the temperature in the long room to a mild, pleasant balminess that makes you want to breathe more deeply and close your eyes. The open vent in the ceiling still admits its thin stream of cool air, but the coolth is now barely perceptible against the general warmth, and it serves only to keep the air fresh without chilling it. The scent of the workers is now part of the scent of the place, a faint, clean smell of wool and linen and honest sweat. Nothing sharp or unpleasant, just the smell of men who have labored steadily without haste. The spinner reaches the far end of his lane, the last backward step taking him to the chalk mark that indicates the completion of this strand's length, and he stops. The turner slows the wheel and then stops it, the drive band falling slack with a soft slap against the great wooden rim, and the hook ceases its rotation. The strand, now perhaps 1,000 feet long, hangs in the air between the hook and the register block, a single long cord of twisted yarns that has never once touched the floor. The spinner nods to the assistant, who brings a pair of iron shears and clips the strand at the hook, then ties a whipping of fine twine around the loose end to prevent unraveling. The strand is then carefully detached from the register, its 3 component yarns cut and tied, and 2 assistants begin the long, slow process of coiling it into a heavy, neat circle on the floor at the far end of the walkway. The coil is larger and darker than the single yarn coils from the morning, a substantial thing that looks like it could hold a weight, and when it is complete, the men lift it together and carry it to the rope store, their steps slow and synchronized. The spinner does not watch them go. He has already returned to his starting position, where a new set of spools has been placed in the rack, and he is tying 3 fresh yarns to the hook with the same simple knot he has tied 100 times today. The turner shakes out his arms once, and then takes the crank again, and the wheel begins its slow, deep creak, and the register hisses, and the spinner's left foot moves backward, beginning the whole cycle again, as steady and unremarkable as the turning of the tide. The strands that were formed through the long afternoon now lie in heavy coils at the far end of the ropewalk, each one a thick, springy cable of twisted yarns that smells of hemp and the faint, clean residue of the spinner's hands. There are 3 such coils, because the rope being laid today is a 3-strand hawser, the kind that will hold a ship steady against a quay or bear the weight of a great anchor hanging from the cathead. The strands are dark, with a light dressing of Stockholm tar that was brushed onto the yarns before the final twist. A preservative film, thin enough to leave the fibres flexible, but thick enough to seal them against salt water and rot. And its scent now rises into the ropewalk air with a sharp, resinous sweetness that cuts through the softer smell of hemp like a low note through a chord. You have walked to the far end of the building to watch this final stage, and from here the ropewalk appears as a long corridor of diminishing light. The windows on either side showing the same grey sky, the same still river. The far door, where the spinning wheels stand, is a small rectangle of brightness, perhaps a quarter of a mile away, and the floor between you and that door is a straight, dark path, scored with the parallel grooves of countless backward walks. Today those grooves will be filled by a single, massive rope that will unite the 3 strands into a cable thicker than a man's forearm, and the work will demand a slowness and a care beyond anything the morning or the afternoon has yet required. At this end of the walkway sits the laying carriage, a sturdy wooden frame on iron wheels that runs on a narrow track set into the floorboards. The carriage is not large, no taller than a man's waist, and on its top surface are 3 iron hooks arranged in a horizontal row, each hook capable of rotating independently through a system of gears, and a single large crank that will be turned by a new man, a layer, who has joined the spinner for this final task. The spinner will walk backward as always, guiding the closing point where the strands meet and twist, but the layer will walk with him, step for step, cranking the carriage hooks to impart the massive, slow twist that will bind the strands into one. The 2 men have worked together before, on many ropes, in many seasons, and they require no words to coordinate their steps, only the shared rhythm of the task. The 3 coiled strands have been lifted onto the carriage by the assistants, their ends drawn out and threaded through the holes of a forming plate, a heavy disc of ironwood shaped like a flat cone, with 3 curved channels radiating from its center. The forming plate will keep the strands apart until the precise moment they converge at the closing point, preventing them from twisting together too early or unevenly. It hangs from a short rope slung over the spinner's shoulder, riding just ahead of his chest, and as he walks backward the plate will travel with him, the 3 strands sliding through its channels with a deep, oily hiss. The ends of the strands have been seized with tarred twine to prevent them from fraying, and they are hitched to the hooks of the carriage with heavy iron shackles that clank once, then fall silent under the steady tension. The spinner takes up his position a few feet in front of the carriage, facing the far door, his back to the direction he will walk. The layer stands beside the carriage, one hand on the crank, his eyes on the forming plate. The assistants have cleared the floor of any loose tools or rollers, because the rope will need to lie directly on the boards as it forms, its own weight enough to keep it straight. The first assistant has placed a wooden trough of the tar mixture near the midpoint of the walkway, along with a long-handled brush for touching up any dry spots on the strands as they pass. Then the assistants withdraw to the sides, and the ropey walk holds its breath. The familiar pre-work silence heavier now, with the weight of the thing about to be made. The spinner nods, and the layer begins to turn the carriage crank. The gears engage with a deep, rumbling click, and the three hooks start to rotate in unison. Slowly, so slowly that you can count the seconds between each full turn. The strands attached to the hooks begin to twist along their entire length, the torsion running away from the carriage in a visible wave. The spinner feels that wave arrive through the forming plate, and at the exact moment when the twist reaches the three channels, he lifts his left foot and takes his first backward step, drawing the strands through the plate and toward the point of convergence. Where the strands emerge from the forming plate, they are still separate, three thick lines running parallel, but a few inches behind the plate, they begin to lean toward one another, compelled by the twist that is coming from the far end. The leaning increases as the spinner walks backward, and then, at a point just ahead of his left hand, the three strands meet and wrap around each other in a sudden, forceful spiral that locks them together into a single, solid cable. The closing happens with a low, grinding sound, the fibres of the strands rubbing against one another under enormous tension, and the newly formed rope emerges from the closing point, dark and dense and quivering, its surface marked by the deep, diagonal grooves of the three-strand lay. The spinner's left hand holds the rope just behind the closing point, fingers curved around its circumference, feeling the immense living tension that vibrates through the hemp like the pulse of a heart. The backward walk is much slower now than it was for the single yarn or the strand. Each step the spinner takes is short and deliberate, his foot setting down with a soft, weighted thud that sends a tremor through the floorboards, and the layer matches his pace exactly, turning the crank in long, heavy sweeps that make the muscles of his back and shoulders stand out beneath his shirt. The carriage rolls forward along its track as the rope grows, pulled by the immense torque, and its iron wheels make a low, steady rumble that harmonizes with the grinding of the closing strands. The sound fills the entire ropey walk, a deep, mechanical growl that you can feel in your sternum, and yet it is not a harsh sound. It is the sound of a huge, slow, orderly process, as calming in its way as the creak of the spinning wheel, but grander, more rooted in the earth. The rope that emerges is a thing of heavy beauty. It is as thick as a ship's bell rope, perhaps 8 inches in circumference, and its surface is a complex landscape of spiral ridges and valleys, the three strands visible as distinct, rounded humps that wind around each other in a perfect, unbroken helix. The tar dressing gives the rope a dark, slightly glossy sheen, and where the light from the high windows falls on it, the highlights run along the ridges like oil on water. The smell of the tar grows stronger as the rope lengthens, a warm, piney, medicinal smell that mingles with the hemp and the iron and the sweat of the men, creating an atmosphere that is dense and ancient, the smell of ships and the sea and the long history of sail. The spinner's right hand is occupied with the forming plate, keeping it centered and steady as the strands feed through. Every few steps he glances down at the channels, checking that the strands are running without friction, that no stray fibre has caught on the ironwood rim. The plate is polished by years of use, and the strands pass through it with a wet, sucking sound that is softer than the hiss of the register block, more like the sound of a rope running through a fair lead on a ship. The layer, meanwhile, watches the twist of the strands between the carriage and the spinner, ensuring that the rotation is even and that no single strand is over-twisting or under-twisting relative to the others. If he sees a strand begin to kink, he eases the crank a fraction. If he sees one run slack, he increases the speed a breath. The two men are as connected as the spinner and turner were this morning, but the stakes feel higher now, because the rope is so heavy and so full of stored energy, that a mistake could release a dangerous snap. But no mistake comes. The work proceeds as smoothly as the tide. The tension in the rope is enormous, far greater than anything in the earlier stages. If you were to touch the forming rope just behind the closing point, you would feel it hard and dense as wood, vibrating with a low, continuous hum. The floorboards beneath the rope creak and settle as the weight comes onto them, and you can see the dust in the cracks between the boards jump slightly with each new increment of lay. The great rope seems almost alive, a long, dark serpent slowly extending itself along the walkway, and the spinner and the layer are riding it, controlling it, shaping it, step by careful step. The afternoon outside the windows has deepened toward evening, though the sky remains stubbornly grey and the light changes only in its angle, not its brightness. The shadows of the window frames now stretch far across the floor, climbing the opposite wall, their edges soft and blurred by the dusty glass. The river, glimpsed through the panes, is empty of boats, its ebb tide now fully running so that the water slides past the quay with a glassy, silent purpose. The ships at anchor have swung on their moorings until their bows point downstream, and their masts tilt slightly against the grey sky, no pennants stirring. The ceasefire holds, and the dockyard remains in its deep, suspended quiet, the only real movement in the world, the slow backward walk of two men making a rope. The assistants have assumed their quiet stations. One stands at the tar trough, brush in hand, waiting for the rope to reach him so he can touch up any pale spots where the tar dressing has worn thin. Another walks slowly alongside the growing rope, a wooden paddle in his hand, not to guide it because the rope is far too heavy to need guiding, but simply to be present, to watch for any snag or twist in the carriage track. The youngest assistant has climbed onto a stool near one of the windows and is cleaning the glass with a rag dipped in vinegar water. His movements slow and circular, the faint smell of vinegar, a sharp, clean counterpoint to the tar. The pigeon has left its beam and now perches on the carriage itself, riding the slow movements with the unconcerned ease of a creature that has lived its whole life among slow-moving things. The spinner has walked perhaps a third of the length of the rope you walk. The rope behind him now a heavy, dark cable that lies in a straight line along the central groove of the floor, its weight pressing the boards into a slight, elastic dip. The tar has transferred from the rope to the floor in places, leaving a dark, tacky trail that the sweeper will later clean with sand and a stiff brush, but that is a task for tomorrow. The spinner's breathing has deepened with the effort of the slower, heavier walk, and a fine sheen of moisture stands on his forehead, though the air remains cool. He blinks it away without breaking his rhythm, and the layer, walking exactly alongside the carriage, matches his breathing unconsciously. The two men inhaling and exhaling in the same slow, four-step cycle. The rope now reaches the assistant with the tar brush, who kneels and applies a thin, even coat to a section where the dressing has become sparse, the brush strokes long and smooth and exactly parallel to the lay of the strands. The fresh tar gleams wetly for a moment before soaking into the hemp, darkening the rope to a uniform black-brown, and the scent spikes briefly, sharp and hot, then settles back into the steady background of the rope walk. The assistant straightens, brushes his hands on his apron, and walks slowly back to the trough to wait for the next dry section, which will not be for many minutes. The layer pauses the crank for a single revolution, while the spinner adjusts the forming plate, which has shifted slightly on its shoulder strap. The spinner tugs the strap tighter, resettles the plate against his chest, and then nods. The crank resumes, the hooks turn, the strands grind together, and the backward walk continues exactly where it left off, the rhythm unbroken in any way that matters. The pause was no longer than the time it takes to draw a deep breath and release it, and the rope does not seem to have noticed. The light through the windows has begun its slow fade from white to a cooler, bluer grey, the first hint of the evening that is still an hour or more away. The everyday hero's hooks, which was warm and balmy through the afternoon, has begun to lose its heat, the thick walls and the high ceiling holding the temperature steady for a while longer, but no longer adding to it. The men's breaths are just beginning to show as faint wisps when they exhale near the cooler air by the windows, but the core of the building remains comfortable, and the work generates its own warmth. The spinner's forearms, bare below his rolled sleeves, are flushed with the steady labor, and the layer's hands on the crank are red and warm, the knuckles white with grip. The rope now stretches more than halfway down the walkway, and the carriage has rolled forward the same distance, its track carrying it smoothly over the worn floorboards. The sound of the iron wheels has become a constant, low-pitched rumble that you no longer hear as separate from the silence. It is simply there, the way the river is there, the way the grey sky is there. The grinding of the closing strands has settled into a deep, regular pulse, a throb that travels through the floor and into your bones, and if you stand very still and close your eyes, you can feel the entire building humming with the slow creation of the rope, every fibre and every board and every brick vibrating in sympathy. The spinner's steady backward walk carries him past the halfway point, and now the far door, the one he has been walking toward for what feels like the entire day, is visibly closer. He does not look at it, but his body knows the distance in the way a sleeping man knows the edge of a bed, and he will stop at exactly the right chalk mark without ever needing to search for it. The layer, walking beside the carriage, has also noted the remaining distance, and he adjusts the crank speed by the tiniest fraction, ensuring that the final few feet of rope will have exactly the correct twist to match the rest. The assistants sense the approaching end and begin to gather near the far end of the walkway, ready to receive the finished rope. The rope now lies like a long black snake from one end of the building almost to the other, its surface gleaming dully under the grey light, its spiral pattern as regular as a screw thread. The smell of tar and hemp and the faint sweetness of the exhausted men wraps the whole space in a blanket of scent, and the silence between the sounds of the work is deep and full. The spinner takes his last 10 backward steps, each one slower than the last, and then his heel touches the chalk mark that indicates the end of the lay. He stops, and the layer stops the crank 1 second later, the carriage hooks freezing mid-turn. The great rope, complete, lies quivering on the floor, its length a little over 1,000 feet, its weight measured in tons, and the quiet that follows its completion is a ringing, resonant quiet, the kind that comes after a long, deep note has faded to nothing. The long windows of the Ropewalk, which all day have admitted a steady grey light of unchanging colour, now begin to show the first pale wash of evening, a subtle shift that enters the building as quietly as the tide leaves the river. The glass panes, dusty and old, filter the outside world into a soft blur, and through them the sky has taken on a cooler tone near the eastern windows, while the western panes, facing the direction of the hidden sun behind the clouds, are just beginning to warm into a faint amber that is barely a colour, more a suggestion of gold resting on the surface of the grey. The spinner does not look up at the windows, because his work is nearly done, and his attention remains on the last few feet of the massive rope that still quivers on the floor. But the changing light falls across his hands and across the dark strands of the hawser, and it alters the look of everything in the long room, softening edges and deepening shadows. The rope lies fully laid now, a single unbroken cable of 3 strands that stretches from the far carriage to the chalk mark at this end of the walkway, a distance that measures more than 100 fathoms. It is a heavy, dark, magnificent thing, its surface a continuous spiral of tarred hemp that gleams where the evening light catches the ridges and sinks into shadow in the valleys between. The twist is perfectly even from end to end, the work of hours of steady coordination between the spinner and the layer, and as the 2 men stand now, still breathing a little more deeply than usual, they look at the rope with the quiet, assessing gaze of craftsmen who know that their product will bear a ship's weight and that it will not fail. No words pass between them. The layer simply wipes his forehead with the sleeve of his shirt, nods once, and begins to secure the carriage crank with a wooden pin that will keep the hooks from turning while the rope is detached. The spinner kneels beside the end of the rope that is nearest the starting mark, the end that has just this moment ceased to twist. He takes up his splicing fiddy and the knife with the bone handle, and he cuts the 3 strands free from the forming plate with a series of careful, deliberate strokes, each cut placed exactly where the strand becomes rope, so that no unravelling can travel backward into the finished lay. The severed ends are immediately seized with tarred twine by the layer, who wraps the twine in tight, close turns and pulls the knots down hard, and then the spinner does the same at the far end, where the rope is still attached to the carriage hooks. The hooks are unshackled with a slight, oiled clank, and the rope, now free at both ends, settles onto the floor with a soft, heavy sigh that sends a few remaining dust motes dancing in the amber light. The spinning wheels, which have been still since the laying began, stand dark and silent at the far end of the building, their drive bands slack, their hooks empty. The bundles of hemp that rode at the spinners' waists this morning are long gone, the last of them used up in the final strands, and their empty cloth wrappings lie folded on the bench beside the clay jug and the wooden cups. The register blocks and the forming plates and the topmaker's guides have all been gathered by the assistants and set in their proper places along the walls, and the tools of the rope-making trade are now at rest, their surfaces oiled and their edges covered with scraps of linen to keep off the dust. The great ropewalk, which has hummed and creaked and rustled since the first grey light of morning, is falling still, and the silence that is spreading through the long brick room is a deep, layered silence, full of the memory of sound. The two assistants who will coil the rope have come forward, and they begin their task at the far end, near the carriage. The coil must be made with care, because a rope of this weight and length cannot simply be piled without thought. It must be laid in a perfect spiral, each turn lying flat against the turn before it, so that when it is needed it will run free without kinks or tangles. The assistants take hold of the rope a few feet from the end and begin to walk in a slow, tight circle, bending the heavy cable into a curve. The rope resists at first, its stiffness and its stored twist making it want to spring straight. But the men are patient and their hands are strong, and they coax it into a smooth arc with the same gentle insistence that the spinner used to coax the yarns into a strand. The circle grows as they walk, step by slow step, and the coil on the floor begins to take shape as a dark, fashioned ring with the end tucked into the center. You watch the coiling from beside the wall, your shoulder against the cool brick, and you feel the evening settle over the dockyard outside, with the same slow, gentle weight that the rope settles onto the floor. The amber light in the western windows has deepened by a few degrees, the gold now strong enough to stain the grey floorboards with long rectangles of warm colour, and the eastern windows have lost their paleness and taken on a soft, dusky blue that is the colour of the sky after the sun has gone, but before the stars appear, after the sun has gone, but before the stars appear. The spinners have gathered their belongings, slinging their leather bottles over their shoulders and tucking their small tools into pockets and pouches, and they stand in a loose, quiet group near the door, talking in low voices that do not carry. The words are about ordinary things, the weather and the tide and what the morrow might bring, and there is no hurry in them, no urgency to leave, only the slow unwinding of a day's companionship. The spinner you have been watching all day has sat down on the low wooden bench, his back against the wall, his hands resting palm up on his thighs. His fingers are stained dark with tar and pale with hemp dust, and the muscles of his forearms twitch slightly with the residue of the long tension. But his face is calm, almost blank, the face of a man whose mind has been emptied by steady labour and who does not yet wish to fill it again. He breathes in the cool air that drifts through the open door, and he watches the assistants coil the rope. But his eyes are unfocused, seeing not the rope, but the shape of the day that is now behind him. The silence that surrounds him is a comfortable silence, a silence earned, and it asks nothing of him. The layer has uncoupled the carriage from the track and is oiling its wheels with a feather dipped in neatsfoot oil, the same smell that you noticed this morning. The wheels turn smoothly now, their rumble silenced, and the carriage will be pushed against the wall until the next laying, which may be tomorrow or the day after, depending on the orders from the dockyard master. The track on the floor, a pair of iron rails set into the boards, lies empty, and the groove down the centre of the walkway, worn by the spinner's backward steps, is visible as a dark, slightly polished line that runs the entire length of the building. It will be walked again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. But for now it is empty, a quiet riverbed waiting for the next flow of motion. The assistants have now coiled most of the rope, and the circle on the floor is perhaps 6 feet across, a dark, perfect spiral that looks like a giant watch spring made of hemp and tar. The final few feet of the rope are being tucked into the center, and the assistant uses a wooden mallet to tap the coil gently, settling the turns against one another so that the whole thing is compact and stable. The sound of the mallet is a soft, muffled thud, a brief percussion that echoes once and then fades, and then the coil is complete. The rope is now a circle, dense and heavy, ready to be carried to the rope store where it will wait in the darkness among other ropes, its strength sleeping until the day a ship calls for it. The light has now shifted fully into evening, and the amber glow in the western windows has climbed the wall, casting the bricks in a warm reddish light that makes the mortar look almost pink. The eastern windows are deep blue, almost purple, and the first faint pin-prick of a star is visible through one of the higher panes, though it is so faint that it might be a trick of the eye. The river, glimpsed through the glass, is a sheet of dark silver, its surface ruffled by the faintest breath of wind that has arisen as the day cools, and the ships at anchor are now black silhouettes against the pale afterglow of the sky, their masts a tracery of thin lines. The tide is fully out now, and the mudbanks along the shore are exposed, dark and glistening, smelling of salt and the deep, ancient mud of the estuary. The youngest assistant has taken up his broom again and is sweeping the floor in slow, broad arcs, gathering the day's accumulation of herds and dust and bits of tarred twine into a pile near the door. The bristles whisper against the wood, a sound so soft and so constant that it blends with the creak of the buildings settling and the distant lap of the river, to form a kind of evening lullaby. The dust rises in a thin cloud, golden where it passes through the last shaft of amber light, and then it settles again, a little further along the floor, waiting for the morning sweep that will come again and again, as long as the rope-walk stands. The spinner stands up from the bench, his joints creaking slightly, and he brushes the hemp dust from his apron with a few flat-handed strokes that send a fine pale cloud swirling around his knees. The dust hangs in the air for a moment and then settles on the floorboards, joining the dust of all the days before. He unties the leather apron and hangs it on the peg where his woolen cap hung this morning, and he takes the cap down and puts it on, pulling the brim low over his forehead. Then he lifts the folded cloth that held his waist bundle and tucks it under his arm, and he picks up his small bundle of personal tools, the knife and the fid and the lump of beeswax, which he wraps in the old linen cloth with the same slow, precise movements that he used to unwrap them at the beginning of the day. The bundle goes into a pocket of his breeches, and he is ready to leave. The other spinners have already begun to drift toward the door, their footsteps soft on the worn boards. The turners and the layer have gathered their own belongings, and the group of men assembles at the threshold with the easy, wordless choreography of those who have left this building together many times. The oldest spinner pauses at the door and looks back along the length of the rope-walk, his eyes travelling the long perspective to the far windows and the great coil of rope on the floor, and his expression is unreadable, perhaps satisfaction, perhaps simply tiredness, perhaps the deep, wordless comfort of a familiar space that has held his labour and will hold it again. He turns and steps outside, and the others follow, their boots sounding on the cobblestones with a soft, scattered rhythm that fades into the quiet of the dockyard. The spinner you have been watching is the last to leave. He pauses beside the great coil of rope and rests his hand on it for a moment, feeling the texture of the tar and the tightness of the lay, a final, wordless check that all is well. The rope is cool and solid under his palm, and he knows its quality as a father might know the weight of a sleeping child. He takes his hand away, and a small smear of tar is left on his skin, which he wipes absently on the side of his breeches. Then he walks to the door, his steps forward now, no longer backward, the groove in the floor marking his path but not guiding him, because his body is already thinking of home and a meal and a chair by the fire. At the door, he turns and looks back into the rope-walk. The long room is empty now, the wheels dark, the tools still, the air heavy with the mingled scents of hemp and tar and wood, and the fading warmth of the working bodies. The great coil of rope sits on the floor like a sleeping animal, its spiral tight and perfect, and beyond it the far windows glow with the last light of the day, a deep amber that is sliding toward orange. The spinner reaches up and takes hold of the heavy oak door, and he pulls it closed with a slow, steady motion, the iron latch clicking into place with a sound that is both final and gentle. The rope-walk is sealed for the night, its silence complete. Outside, the dockyard is a landscape of soft shadows and fading light. The cobblestones are dark and a little damp with the evening dew that has already begun to form, and the air is cool and clean, smelling of the river and the mud and the faint, distant hint of smoke from the cottages up the hill. The spinner walks along the quay, his footsteps slow and even, and he passes the silent sail lofts and the dark mast houses and the forge with its chimney cold. The cat that slept on the timber stack is gone, slipped away to some warm corner. The gulls have settled on the rooftops, their heads tucked. The ships at anchor show no lights, and their hulls are black against the darkening water. The river laps at the piers with a slow, soft, endless sound that has no beginning and no end. The spinner reaches the dockyard gate, where the watchman sits on a wooden stool beside a lantern that has just been lit. The lantern flame is small and yellow, barely bright enough to illuminate the gate, and it casts a pool of warm light on the cobblestones. The watchman looks up as the spinner passes, and no words are exchanged, only a slight lift of the chin, a recognition. The spinner walks through the gate and up the narrow lane that leads toward the town, his figure growing smaller and dimmer until it merges with the dusk. The watchman settles back on his stool, and the lantern burns on, a single point of light in the vast quiet darkness of the dockyard. Behind him, the ropewalk stands long and dark and silent, its high windows now showing only the deep blue of the evening sky and the faint glitter of a few early stars. The bricks have cooled, and the dust has settled, and the scent of hemp and tar will linger in the still air until morning, when the door will open again, and the spinner will return, the wheel will turn, the hemp will twist, and the long backward walk will begin anew. But that is hours away, and for now the building rests, holding its peace in the heart of the sleeping dockyard, and the river flows on, and the night covers everything with its slow, patient, immeasurable calm. The great coil of rope, dark with tar and tight with a twist of 3 strands, rests on the wooden floor of the ropey walk for only a little while longer before the assistants gather themselves to move it. The 2 young men who coiled it have been joined by a third, an older man with a broad back and hands the color of weathered oak, and together they look at the coil with the measuring gaze of those who must carry a heavy weight along a narrow path in the fading light. The rope walk around them is now fully quiet, the wheel still, the air cooling, the last amber glow from the western windows fading into a deeper blue, and the only sound is the soft shuffle of their feet as they position themselves around the circle of hemp. They crouch with the coordinated slowness of men who have done this many times, and each one takes a grip on the coil at a different point, their fingers curling under the tight turns, the tar tacky but not slippery against their palms. On a wordless count that exists only in the rhythm of their breathing, they lift together, and the coil rises from the floor, a dense, weighty ring of cable that sags slightly between their hands but holds its shape. They carry it not on their shoulders but at waist height, their arms braced, their steps short and synchronized, moving toward the door at the end of the rope walk that opens not onto the quay but onto a narrow alley between the long building and the next. The door is already open, held by the youngest assistant who has set aside his broom for this final task, and the men pass through it with careful turns of their bodies, the coil swinging gently as they navigate the threshold. Outside, the alley is dim and cool, paved with the same cobblestones as the quay, and the high brick walls on either side channel the evening air into a faint, steady draught that smells of damp stone and the distant mud of the river. The men walk along this alley in a slow, shuffling procession, the coil between them like a huge, dark serpent they have captured and are now putting to bed. The rope store stands at the end of the alley, a long, low building of the same old brick as the rope walk, but with fewer windows and a heavier door. It was built to keep the finished ropes dry and dark and safe from the sun that would weaken the hemp, and its walls are thick, its roof of tile laid over oak beams blackened by age. The door is a broad slab of elm wood that swings on iron hinges with a low, grudging creak when the youngest assistant pushes it open, and from the darkness inside there rolls out a scent so thick and so rich that it stops you for a moment, a scent of tar and hemp, and the faint salty ghost of the sea that the ropes will one day meet, but have not yet known. The assistants carry the coil across the threshold and into the store, and your eyes, which have grown accustomed to the dim evening outside, take a moment to adjust to the deeper darkness within. There are no lanterns in the rope store because flame is not permitted near the tarred hemp, but a little of the fading daylight follows the men through the open door, enough to reveal the interior as a long, low space lined with wooden racks and heavy shelves. On these racks, and on the floor itself, lie other coils of rope, some small enough to be carried by one man, others as large as the one the assistants are carrying now, all of them dark and silent and waiting. The coils are arranged by size and type, the hawsers and the cables and the lighter running rigging, each one a perfect spiral of twisted hemp that has been laid to rest until the day a shipwright or a boatswain comes to claim it. The men lower the new coil into an empty space on the floor near the far wall, bending their knees and letting the weight down with the same synchronized care they used to lift it. The coil settles onto the wooden boards with a soft, final thud, and the assistants straighten up, breathing a little harder, brushing the tar from their hands onto the fronts of their aprons. One of them reaches down and adjusts the outermost turn of the coil so that it lies perfectly flat against its neighbor, a small adjustment that is made out of habit rather than necessity. And then the three of them stand for a moment in the dimness, looking at the newest addition to the store's quiet collection. The rope now rests among its fellows, a dark ring among dark rings, its surface already cooling in the still air of the store. It will lie here for weeks or months, perhaps even a year if the ceasefire holds and the ships stay idle in their moorings, but the tar will preserve it, and the darkness will keep it supple. And when the time comes, it will be lifted out and carried to a ship and put to work, hauling an anchor or bracing a yard, and it will do that work without complaint, because it was made well by men who walked backward in a long brick building on a grey day. But that is all in the future, and the future is not a thing that the rope or the men or the store itself seems to think about. There is only the present, the coil settled in the dark, the assistants turning toward the door, the day's work finally complete. You step out of the rope store and back into the alley, and the cool evening air feels fresh and thin after the dense, tar-heavy atmosphere inside. The youngest assistant pulls the heavy door closed, and the iron latch falls into place with a deep, solid sound that echoes once between the brick walls and then is swallowed by the larger quiet of the dockyard. The assistants walk away along the alley, their footsteps fading, and you are left standing in the dim passage between the buildings, the wall of the ropey walk on one side and the wall of the store on the other, the sky above a narrow strip of deep blue that is already showing a few stars. You walk slowly back along the alley toward the river, and when you emerge onto the quayside, you find that the evening has fully arrived while you are inside. The grey overcast of the day has broken apart into long, thin clouds that are drifting toward the east, and between them the sky is a pale, watery green at the horizon, grading upward into the darker blue of approaching night. The river is a sheet of black glass, perfectly still now that the tide has paused at its lowest ebb, and the ships at anchor are solid shadows against the fading light, their masts and yards drawing a complex lattice of dark lines across the sky. No lights show on any of the vessels because the fleet is at rest and the crews are ashore or below decks, and the only movement on the water is the faint, occasional ripple of a fish rising and falling again without a sound. The cobblestones of the quay are dark and a little slick with the evening damp, and your footsteps make a soft, even sound as you walk along the edge of the basin. The buildings of the dockyard loom in the dusk, their roofs and chimneys cutting blunt shapes against the sky, and the only lit window in the whole expanse is the small yellow square of the watchman's lantern in the gatehouse by the main entrance. You walk toward that light, not because you have a purpose, but because it is the only point of warmth in the cooling night, and as you draw closer, you see the watchman himself, an old man with a white beard and a heavy coat, sitting on his wooden stool beside the gate. The watchman has just lit his lantern, a square box of iron and horn with a small oil flame burning inside, and he is adjusting the wick with a careful, steady hand. The flame steadies and brightens, casting a pool of orange light on the cobblestones around his feet, and the watchman settles back onto his stool, with the sigh of a man whose work is just beginning and will require nothing more than patience and wakefulness. He sees you as you approach, and he nods, a slow, calm nod that asks no questions and offers no greeting beyond the simple acknowledgement of your presence. You stand near the lantern for a moment, feeling the faint warmth of the flame on your face, and you look back across the dockyard toward the long, dark shape of the ropey walk. The ropey walk from here is a low, narrow silhouette, its roofline a straight horizontal against the fading sky, its high windows now dark and empty. It looks smaller at night, less imposing, a simple brick shed like any other, and yet you know what it contains, the great spinning wheels standing silent on the worn floor, the tools resting on their pegs, the hemp dust settled in the cracks between the boards, the long groove running down the center like a dry riverbed, and the smell of hemp and tar and wood still hanging in the still air. The building is asleep, and it dreams of nothing, but its presence is a quiet, steady thing at the edge of the dark river. There is no wind, and the air is so still that you can hear the distant faint sound of a dog barking somewhere in the town up the hill, a sound so far away that it is more memory than hearing. The watchman shifts on his stool and coughs once, a soft, dry sound, and then he is still again. The lantern flame burns steadily inside its horn case, and the light it casts makes the cobblestones look like a mosaic of gold and black, each stone outlined by a thin shadow. The river laps once, a single lazy slap of water against a pier, and then it is quiet again. The spinner, the man you followed all day, is now home. He has walked up the narrow lane from the dockyard gate, his steps slow and even on the packed earth of the road, and he has passed the dark cottages and the silent inn and the small chapel, with its bell still and its door closed. His cottage stands at the edge of the town, a small house of brick and timber with a low roof and a garden where rosemary and thyme grow in neat rows. He opens the wooden door, which does not lock, and he steps inside to find a single candle burning on the table and a pot of soup warming on the hearth, and his wife sitting in her chair with a piece of mending in her lap. He hangs his cap on a peg, sets his tools on the shelf by the door, and sits down in his own chair, and the day is over. The night deepens over the dockyard, and the stars come out fully, scattered across the sky like fine dust on a dark cloth. The watchman rises once to walk a slow circuit of the gate, his lantern swinging gently in his hand, and the beam of light passes over the walls and the cobblestones and the still water of the basin without revealing anything that was not there a moment before. He returns to his stool and sits down, and the lantern is set back in its place, and the quiet resumes. Inside the ropey walk, the darkness is absolute. The high windows admit only the faintest trace of starlight, not enough to illuminate anything, and the long room is a tunnel of pure shadow stretching from one door to the other. The spinning wheels are invisible, their great rims and leather bands and iron hooks all dissolved into the blackness, and the wooden floor is a dark plain that gives back no reflection. The groove down the center is still there, a shallow channel in the boards, and the dust that settled after the last sweep lies in a fine, even layer over everything, a soft grey pall that will be stirred again in the morning. The smell of hemp and tar and oil and wood is stronger in the dark, as if the absence of light concentrates the sense, and the air is cool and perfectly still. Through one high window on the riverside, a single star is visible, framed exactly in the center of a dusty pane, as if someone had placed it there on purpose. The star is a point of white light, small and cold and very far away, and its light falls through the glass and onto the dark floor in a spot no bigger than a coin. If you could stand in the ropey walk now, in this absolute quiet, you might see that star and watch it move as the night turns, sliding slowly across the window pane until it disappears at the edge of the frame, and then the window would be dark again. But you are not in the ropey walk, and no one is, and the star shines on the empty floor without an audience, a tiny, patient light in the great sleeping building. The river outside continues its slow, eternal work, the tide beginning to turn again now, the water sliding back toward the land in a silent, invisible flow that will lift the ships a little higher on their moorings and cover the mud banks that were exposed at low water. The ever and the flies, the coming and the going, the twice daily breath of the sea, it is the rhythm beneath all the rhythms of the dockyard, the clock that runs without winding. It was flowing when the ropey walk was built, and it will flow long after, and the ropes made in the long brick building will hold ships against its pull and ease with its push, and then those ropes will wear out and be replaced by new ones, made on the same worn floor by the same slow backward walk. The ceasefire that held the dockyard in its quiet suspended state today will not last forever, because no ceasefire does, but while it lasts the work will continue without hurry, without drama, without any mark on the larger history of nations. The men will come in the morning, the hemp will be dressed, the wheel will turn, the backward steps will trace the same groove, and the yarn will lengthen into strands, and the strands into ropes, and the ropes will go into the dark store to wait. It is a craft that has been practiced in this place for as long as anyone remembers, and will be practiced for as long as ships are made of wood and sail, and it asks nothing of the world except patience and hemp and the slow, steady hands of those who walk backward. The night now is deep and full, and the dockyard lies under the stars like a great black map of itself, the buildings and the quays and the ships all drawn in shades of darkness. The watchman's lantern is a single point of light at the gate, and the star in the Ropewalk window is a single point of light in the long darkness, and the two lights do not know each other and do not need to. The river moves, the ships rest, the rope sleeps in its coil among the other coils, and the day that has passed falls gently into the calm of history, another quiet, uneventful turn, in a cycle that has no end. The spinner will wake in the morning, pull on his boots, and walk down the lane to the dockyard gate, and the ropewalk will open its heavy door, and the long backward walking will begin again, as it always has, as it always will.